The House will be in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., January 13th, 2022. I hereby appoint the Honorable Brenda L. Lawrence to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Gibbon.
Would you pray with me? Holy and omnipotent God, we stand before you, vulnerable to your power at work within and around us. Like precious metal, we are being forged, tested like silver, formed by your creative hands. In these moments, may we trust that you are refining us, restoring us, and shaping us, that we would best reflect your image in all we do. We also stand before this nation, exposed to a multitude of opinions and a host of challenges, bearing the responsibilities that have been placed in our care. Many voices attempt to drown out your own divine word that has called us to hold fast to our faith in your perfect righteousness. In these moments, may we stand firm in our obedience to you, to your claim on our lives. May the trials in our lives and the testing of our faith produce steadfastness in our walk with you. In your abiding name we pray. Amen.
Pursuant to Section 11A of the House Resolution 188, the Journal of the Last Day's proceeding is approved. Now it asks the Pledge of Allegiance to be led by the gentleman from California, Mr. Tucano.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will entertain requests up to 5 one-minute speeches from each side of the aisle. From what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the lady is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today to celebrate Korean American Day, which marks the arrival of the first group of Korean immigrants to the United States in 1903. I am proud to represent tens of thousands of Korean Americans in Georgia's 7th District. These individuals are critical members of our community, from small business owners to healthcare workers that continue to support us throughout the pandemic. I would like to take this time to acknowledge Korean American leaders in my district. Representative Sam Park is the grandson of refugees from the Korean War, who became the first Asian American and openly gay person elected to the Georgia State House of Representatives. Michelle Kang serves as president of the Korean American Public Action Committee and is a tireless leader in the community. It is an honor to work with each of you. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been challenged with an increase in the number of anti-Asian hate crimes. This Korean American Day, I am particularly grateful to all of those working to address and end anti-Asian hate in Georgia and across the country. I look forward to continuing this work in Congress. Thank you. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa
I
seek
request
recognition?
unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak on an issue that's important for every American. I know the importance of each vote and understand the difference one vote, or 6, can make. Our country was founded on the right to vote in fair and free elections and faith in the election systems that conduct those elections. Since Iowa implemented new voting laws in 2017, our elections have seen record turnout and participation. Right now, the majority is pushing a federal takeover of elections, overriding laws in states like Iowa. The proposed legislation would limit voter ID laws, which are supported by the overwhelming majority of Americans. It would also allow politicians to use taxpayer dollars to run political ads, meaning your money could go to candidates and issues you do not support. Finally, it would implement a one-size-fits-all set of regulations instead of allowing individual states to establish laws that work for them as provided in our Constitution. Voters in each congressional district across the country are best informed to choose their congressional representation. They do not need interference from Washington, D.C. We should be working to pass bipartisan and common sense voting laws, not pushing a partisan agenda and playing political games. Let's make sure that everyone can vote and that every vote counts. Thank you. I yield back my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my
Without
remarks.
objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to call attention to an urgent problem facing my district. Each and every one of these dots represents children with elevated toxic levels of lead in their blood. The red dots represent the higher levels, the yellow dots, obviously, the lower levels. You could almost draw my district if you follow the red dots. The fact is, Madam Speaker, that many of these kids are being poisoned by lead in their homes and, yes, even in their schools. This is a problem and disproportionately impacts Latinos in our community. We need action to replace these lead pipes and ensure our kids have clean, safe water no matter where they live. That's why I'm proud of our work at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This law will bring $2.9 billion to replace lead pipes in Texas schools. While we have more work to do, our work in this chamber is a critical first step to improving our infrastructure and protecting our children. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor the life of Clarence Morgan, the longtime County Recreation Director for Effingham County. Clarence started with the department in 1980 and worked until he was promoted to director in 2001. His passion for health and wellness, including promoting an active lifestyle for community members, culminated in his development of the Effingham County Recreation Department. With limited resources and hard work, Clarence managed to grow the program into one of the top programs in the state. In 2020, the brand new state-of-the-art gym was opened and named in his honor. Known by all for his integrity and great strength of character, Clarence dedicated his life to ensuring a brighter, healthier future for Effingham County residents. The department that he reignited is a testament to his life's work. Our state and our community will forever remember the life and legacy of Clarence Morgan. My thoughts and prayers are with his family and his friends as we mourn the loss of this great Georgian. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to remember Marta Macias Brown, a longtime public servant, community leader, and beloved constituent of mine. I had the privilege of knowing Marta way before I took office and started representing a portion of Marta's late husband's district, the former Congressman George E. Brown, Jr., whose portrait hangs as a former chairman in the Science Committee room. Marta dedicated her career to advocating for social justice, women's rights, and high-quality education for students. She used her voice to eliminate barriers and create spaces for marginalized groups. She was a proud Latina. She co-founded one of the first Spanish-language publications in the Inland Empire called El Chicano to share important news within our community. Marta spent her life uplifting and empowering others, and anyone who knew her knew of her could easily speak to the love that she had for her community and the commitment she embodied for equality. To the Macias Brown family and all those who knew, loved, and respected her, I offer my deepest condolences. Marta's legacy will always be cherished. I thank you and yield back, Madam Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to honor the 77 Kentuckians who lost their lives to the horrific tornadoes that devastated our Commonwealth this December. May we continue to lift up all of those who were affected by these storms and support the rebuilding of homes, businesses, and livelihoods. We lost 17 Kentuckians in my district, all in my home county of Warren County. We must ensure their memories are never forgotten and ask that Americans keep these families and these names in their prayers. Alicia Bessage, Alma Bessage, Elma Bessage, Samantha Bessage, Samir Bessage, Nariah Brown, Nolan Brown, Niles Brown, Naisa Brown, Rachel Brown, Stephen Brown, Terry Jane Saw May, Corey Scott, Victoria Smith, May White, and Robert Williams, Jr. May they rest in peace. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Nevada seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to honor a great son of Nevada, Senator Harry Mason Reid. Senator Reid was raised in a home with dirt floors in Searchlight, Nevada. And even as he rose to the highest levels of power, including this chamber, he never forgot his small-town roots. In the Senate, he fought for all of us. He championed the DREAM Act and brought young dreamers to Capitol Hill. He fought against Yucca Mountain, and because of his work to pass the Affordable Care Act, 31 million Americans have health care today. Most people don't know this, but long before he was a senator, he paid his way through law school by serving with the U.S. Capitol Police. He protected this Capitol, and he defended our democracy. Senator Reid, thank you for your lifetime of service. May you rest in peace.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I was raised with one brother, but I truly felt like I had dozens and dozens of siblings. You see, my cousins and I grew up a little differently than most families. We had a patriarch of our family who made sure that multiple times a year we all got together for a big hoorah. 4th of July, Kids Week, Christmas. Many of my favorite memories of my entire life stem from the times we all gathered at the Mountain House. Wayne Smith, my great uncle, taught us the way to be truly wealthy was to have a strong family. Papaw passed away on January 10th. He was about to celebrate 63 years of marriage. He was able to touch people's souls with the way he talked. He would skip classes in high school so that he could work, yet still managed to be one of the wisest men I've ever known. He taught all of his grandsons how to drive a stick shift in a pickup truck he had since 1993. He made a bet with his son to quit smoking and held up his end of the bargain for 43 years. He was the original grill master in our family. He drank his coffee black or didn't drink it at all. I'm very proud to say that he got to see the Braves win the World Series last season. Papaw, we all love you so much. Thank you for imparting so much wisdom in our lives. Thank you for making sure we all grew up with endless cousins who are truly brothers and sisters now. Go Braves, and rest in peace, Wayne Calvin Smith. With that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to honor the work of Al Curlin, who has dedicated nearly 3 decades to supporting youth and families throughout the 13th Congressional District. From his early efforts in grassroots engagement in Washington Heights, Al's work has inspired countless youth, advocates, social justice activists, and civic mentors across the city of New York. Al has long championed ensuring marginalized youth have a voice and are empowered to thrive, and I'm proud to recognize his contributions today. His latest essay, The Soul of Adolescence, Aligned with the Heart of Democracy, follows his journey of discovering his life purpose and his understanding of adolescent potential and wisdom. His candor and vulnerability have led to countless young people finding their full potential throughout community involvement and strengthening our community. Al Curlin has significantly contributed to our community, and for that, we are thankful. I commend him for his unwavering dedication to all who call our city home and applaud his tireless efforts to make our community stronger for the next generation of civic leaders. I yield back, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam, I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. On March 29th, 1971, in Pasadena, Texas, Mickey Gilley opened a honky-tonk bearing his name and changed the world of country music forever. Gilley's reputation grew so much that Hollywood took notice with the hit movie Urban Cowboy. Filmed in and around the Pasadena location, man was it a hit. It was inspired by the real-life romance of a pair of the club's patrons. Urban Cowboy put Gillies on the map. It revived music careers and launched others. It introduced two-stepping to a whole new audience and created a lifestyle which has been adopted by millions, Madam Speaker. 40 years later, America's love of Wrangler jeans, cowboy boots, and pickup trucks underscores that lasting cultural legacy. Although the club is no more, Gillies is certainly not forgotten. Its memory lives on decades later through music and film, of course, but even more importantly, through the lives and the loves of those who frequented Gillies. And you always knew when someone had been to Gillies. They had the bumper sticker to prove it. So thank you, Mickey Gilly, for introducing our way of life to the world, and thank you to the Galveston Chamber of Commerce at 177 years young for Texas, its oldest Chamber of Commerce, and for honoring the 50th anniversary of our great Southeast Texas True Country Club and Mr. Mickey Gilly. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 868, I call up the bill H.R. 5746 to amend Title 51 United States Code to extend the authority of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to enter into leases of non-excess property of the administration with the Senate amendment thereto. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have a motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the bill, the title of the bill, designate the Senate amendments, and designate the motion.
H.R. 5746, an act to amend Title 51 United States Code to extend the authority of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to enter into leases of non-excess property of the administration, Senate amendment. Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina moves that the House concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746 with an amendment consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-28.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have
Gentleman will suspend.
I'm sorry.
Pursuant to House Resolution 868, the motion shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided by and controlled by the chair and ranking member, minority member of the Committee on House Administration and their respective designees.
Thank you,
The gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you
and
very
gentleman
much.
from Illinois, Mr. Davis, will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Now it's my turn. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material into the record on the House amendment to the Senate amendment H.R. 5746. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 5746, the Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act. As President Biden made clear in his speech in Atlanta on Tuesday, the time to act to protect the right to vote and the very essence of our democracy is now. And the bill we are considering today meets the gravity of this moment. H.R. 5746, Mr. Speaker, combines two pieces of legislation vital to ensuring every American has free, equitable, and secure access to the ballot. the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the latter of which critically also includes the Native American Voting Rights Act. Together, Mr. Speaker, these bills will combat the wave of voter suppression laws we see enacted in states all across the country following the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder, a decision that undermined the essential pre-clearance protections of the Voting Rights Act. Actions which accelerated at an alarming rate following the unprecedented voter turnout in the 2020 elections. Rather than responding to increased voter participation with welcoming arms and pro-voter policies, states have instead been enacting laws that roll back access and aim to erect roadblocks to the ballot box. Despite a 2020 election that election security experts said was the most secure in American history, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, 19 states have enacted 34 restrictive voting laws in the last 12 months. The time, Mr. Speaker, to act is now. Voter suppression and discrimination are alive and well. It is our duty and firmly within our constitutional powers as a Congress to protect the rights of the voter and ensure equal access to the franchise. This bill, Mr. Speaker, does just that. It sets nationwide standards for access to early voting. It promotes voter registration through automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and online voter registration. It gives every voter access to no-excuse absentee voting, protects the security of our election infrastructure and our precious election workers. It addresses the rising threat of election subversion, puts an end to partisan gerrymandering, curbs the torrent of dark money flooding our politics. Yes, it restores the critical protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and it protects the right to vote for Native American voters. We must set an example as a democracy and encourage. Mr. Speaker, we must encourage rather than suppress voter participation in our electoral process. This legislation is critical. It is so critical to protecting our democracy. I encourage all of my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, to support this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill, which was originally about NASA and went through the Science and Technology Committee, has seen more than 700 pages of election law tacked onto it just late last night. If it were to become law, it would give up to $7.2 million of public funding to the campaign of each one of my colleagues, all of us. This is not about voting rights. This is about power and control. $7.2 million is more money than most Americans can even dream of having. Yet here we are considering another Democrat bill that takes public funding and doesn't give it to the American people, but puts it in the campaign coffers of members of Congress. Members who vote for this bill are voting to line their own campaign coffers, all while falsely telling the American people that we have a voting rights crisis in this country and that we must pass this bill because the era of Jim Crow 2.0 is upon us. It's the definition of corruption. Thankfully, the American people don't seem to be buying the Democrats' rhetoric. According to polling, more Americans, including independents, believe voting laws are too lax and insecure than those who believe voting laws are too restrictive. No matter how many times the president and other Democrats get up in the front of the American people and try to manufacture a voting rights crisis in this country by using rhetoric like Jim Crow 2.0, or now comparing Republicans to Democrat elected segregationists Bull Connor, as President Biden suggested this week in Georgia, there's still no evidence of widespread voter suppression. In our hearings at the House Administration Committee over the last 3 years, no one has ever produced a single voter who was eligible to vote but wasn't able to. In fact, 2020 saw the highest voter turnout in 120 years, and according to Pew, 94% of Americans say it's easy to vote. Misrepresenting and in some cases flat out lying about the laws states have passed to increase voter confidence in our elections is also part of the Democrats' playbook to manufacture a voting rights crisis. In fact, President Biden has earned 4 Pinocchios for his false claims about Georgia's voting laws. The laws these states are passing to bolster voter confidence make it easier to vote. than ever before while protecting the integrity of our elections. Georgia's new, quote, voter suppression law has more days of early in-person voting than New York. And Texas's, quote, voter suppression law ends pandemic exceptions like universal drive-through voting and 24-hour voting. Neither existed in Texas before 2020. Neither widely exists even in blue states. And I think most of us can agree that nothing good can come from 24-hour drive-through voting. The bill we're considering today is not about increasing voting rights for the American people, and this is not a compromise. This bill still contains the worst provisions of H.R. 1. It still publicly funds members' campaigns. It nationalizes and centralizes our election system, makes Merrick Garland the election czar, puts unelected bureaucrats in charge of states' voting laws instead of the American people. It destroys the First Amendment, weakens states' abilities to maintain accurate voter rolls, prevents states from implementing strict voter ID laws, despite the majority of Americans supporting voter ID laws, and the list goes on and on. As terrible as those provisions are, nothing screams this bill isn't for the American people more than the fact that it gives every one of us, every member of Congress, and their own campaigns up to $7.2 million in public funding. The old saying is, follow the money. And I think that's incredibly relevant here. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, Mr. Jeffries.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we are here today defending our democracy for one reason and one reason alone. It's because the radical right has decided that the only way they can consistently win elections is to engage in massive voter suppression. The right to vote is sacred. The right to vote is special. The right to vote is sacrosanct and central to the integrity of our democracy. There are people who died, lost their lives, shed blood to make sure that black people and everyone in America could vote. We're not going backward. We're only going to go forward. You better back up off of us. We will pass the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We will pass the Joe Manchin Freedom to Vote Act. We will get it to Joe Biden's desk, and we will end the era of voter suppression in America once and for all.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois.
Defending democracy, $7.2 million at a time. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin and member of the House Administration Committee, Representative Stile.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, it may be a new year, but the Democrats are up to the same tricks, providing text of this legislation last night for a vote in the morning. They want to gut key voter integrity provisions, and they want to bust the Senate's filibuster in the process to do it. But I think it's important the American people understand some of the key and most egregious provisions in this bill. Let me just highlight the top 4. This bill guts voter ID laws. And the irony shouldn't be lost that these are the same Democrats that want you to show an ID and a vaccine card to be able to have dinner in cities like Washington, D.C. or New York. This bill puts federal dollars into politicians' reelection campaigns. I've heard a lot of complaints about elections in my time. I have never had one person tell me our elections don't have enough money. This bill restricts states' ability to maintain their voter rolls that are essential so we know who's eligible to vote. And this bill mandates that ballots can be counted 7 days after the end of the election, delaying the final results. Delaying the final results does not instill confidence in our elections. Instead, by working to remove key voter integrity provisions in our elections, Americans will have less confidence in their elections. My priority is to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. This bill fails that test, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, our Assistant Speaker, Ms. Clark.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the January 6th insurrection may have been quelled, but the assault on our democracy is alive. Across 19 states, Republican legislatures have enacted 33 voter suppression laws. Here in Congress, we have witnessed unanimous Republican obstruction against common sense pro-democracy voter protections. Early voting, vote by mail, election day as a federal holiday. When did protecting the right to vote become partisan? When it became about the powerful and not the people. We can't sit on the sidelines while the most precious sacred tool in our democracy is eroded. The question before us is simple and yet profound. Are you for the continuation of our democracy or are you not? Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to my good friend from Oklahoma, ranking member on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Mr. Lucas.
Gentleman
Thank you,
is
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker, and I rise in strong opposition to this federal takeover elections. I'm disappointed that the bill underlying has been gutted, a bill that was crafted in a bipartisan, practical way to address the surplus resources at NASA to generate resources for the agency. I would say this to my friends in the majority. I've served in the minority and the majority several times back and forth. I ask you, why are you trying so hard to make me a chairman again? We pass a bill today to allow another body to pontificate. They'll not be able to pass anything. You will inflame your base because you can't do anything. You will inflame my base because you're trying to make dramatic changes. Why are you trying to make it so easy for me to be a chairman again? I guess I should thank you, and I would, except for things like this missed opportunity to reauthorize this important piece of legislation for NASA. When we have committees like Science, Space, and Technology that work together, that work in a productive way, that can persuade the majority of this body to pass their legislation, we should allow the legislative process to work. Thank you, my friends. I look forward to the next session.
The gentleman is reminded to refer your remarks to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Georgia, my friend, Ms. Nakima Williams.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to share the words of my constituent, Yolanda Renee King, that I received this morning. I'm 13 years old and the only grandchild of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. When I was just 5 years old in 2013, the Supreme Court undid the Voting Rights Act that my grandparents and so many in their generation fought and died for. When I was 12 in 2021, the Supreme Court further weakened the law until there is almost nothing left. States like my home state of Georgia were ready and waiting. They immediately passed laws that make it harder for people to vote, make it impossible to protect elections, and even criminalize the act of passing out food and water to people waiting in long lines. That means I and my peers have fewer rights today than we had the day we were born. I can only imagine what my grandparents would say about that. We must pass federal voting rights legislation now to ensure democracy for all Americans. We cannot wait. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I do a time check with my favorite timekeeper up there?
Has 23 minutes. The gentleman from North Carolina has 24.
All right, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the founder of the Election Integrity Caucus, my good friend from New York, Ms. Tenney.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's Groundhog Day again on the House floor. Yet again, our Democratic colleagues continue to gaslight the American people by claiming that despite record turnout in recent elections, Republicans are scheming to steal the sacred right to vote from our fellow citizens. What is their solution to the problem, which they assure you is very real? It just so happens to be a partisan federal takeover of elections that empowers unelected bureaucrats in Washington to oversee local elections and overturn popular voting protection laws. That is not democracy. That is a violation of our Constitution. The freedom to vote, the John R. Lewis Voting Act, which was deceitfully added to a Nassau leasing authorities bill in the dead of the night, is a transparent attempt to diminish the voting power of law-abiding American citizens. Madam Speaker, my colleagues are on the other side of the aisle are right about one thing. Democracy and the principle of one citizen, one vote are indeed being threatened. The Democrats are in fact cynically championing this effort in spite of the fact that the Democratic voters in New York State, a highly blue Democratic state, rejected the very provisions in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act by a substantial margin in a referendum vote just this past election. With every attempt to allow non-citizens to vote and with each push to ban common sense voter identification laws, Democrats in Congress and in places like New York City attack and erode the election integrity. However, by the way, Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution clearly states and protects the rights of our states to determine voting laws and practices. However, the legislation before us today would force upon the nation a laundry list of damaging federal policies, creating a chaos and insecurity in our elections, making it easier to cheat, and overriding basic election integrity measures. This assault must be stopped. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this misguided legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Michigan, the second vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Today I stand here on the shoulders of my grandmother and my grandfather, who migrated to the north from the south, who took me every election day, dressed up, and educated me every step of the way to understand the power of the right to vote. She was denied the right to vote. It is heartbreaking that this bill that's been passed time and time again is now a political ploy. We know that the freedoms and the rights of America is based and bred from voting rights. I stand here today in support of passing this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record Committee on House Administration Republicans Elections Clause report?
Without objection.
Thank you. I'd like to take this time to yield a minute and a half to my good friend from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in opposition to H.R. 5746. Late last night, the Democrats hijacked a bipartisan piece of legislation that I helped draft to allow NASA to lease property and help fund their own budget shortfalls. This bill would have been vital to America's space program and Mississippi's 4th District with Stennis Space Center in our backyard. To no one's surprise, Democrat socialists, hell-bent on minimizing the power of American voters, have jammed through their radical agenda to include this so-called voting rights legislation. This legislation only does one thing. It ensures that Democrats remain in power by tipping the scales by limiting your First Amendment and slashing states' rights. Why else would the Democrats spend so much time catering to non-citizens, giving them taxpayer benefits, allowing them to stay in our country, and now giving them the ability to unconstitutionally vote in American elections? Democrats believe that behind every illegal immigrant is a Democrat voter only waiting for a bill like this to pass. This legislation shreds our founding documents and bastardizes the sacred rights of American citizens only to appease a group of socialists. We all know that Democrats need every advantage to give them any hope in November after seeing their commander-in-chief's gross incompetence and tanking approval ratings. They have the slimmest House majority in history and an even split in the Senate, stalemated by a few Democrats who refuse to bow to the demands of the socialist agenda. Democrats know the American people reject their ridiculous policies, and we cannot allow them to cheat their way back into power with this bill. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on this hijacked bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, the Dean of the Florida delegation, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear about what is happening here. We are at a crossroads. Free and fair elections are essential to keeping this fragile democracy intact. The American people must hear this loud and clear. There are people in power that don't want you to vote, and they are using every tool in their toolbox to make it harder. My fellow Americans, you cannot afford to sleep on this. People in power and with influence are actively trying to take away your right to vote. America must confront this harsh reality. They are purging voter rolls, making voter registration more difficult, and cracking down on vote by mail, all while we remain in the midst of a pandemic. Voter suppression has not been consigned to the history books. It continues today, right here, right now, and the impact continues to fall disproportionately on communities of color. These policies are being actively pursued all over the country in places like my home state of Florida, where the governor wants to create a voting police force to intimidate voters. We must not allow those who seek to consolidate power and put a thumb on the scales of the democratic process to succeed. Our friends in the Senate must stand up for democracy and restore government of, by, and for the people. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to my good friend from the state of Wisconsin, Congressman Tiffany.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, in a desperate attempt to maintain their waning grip on power, the majority is attempting to hijack a bill related to NASA in order to promote voter fraud and invalidate state voter ID laws. But that's not all. The Democrats want to institutionalize ballot harvesting schemes, mandate the use of unverifiable mail ballots, and pour public dollars into the campaign coffers of wealthy politicians. You heard that right, Mr. and Mrs. America. Biden inflation skyrockets, while Democrats are going to raid the Treasury to pay for their political ads. But that's just the beginning. A few days ago, New York City adopted a policy allowing non-citizens to vote, effectively legalizing foreign election interference. And you can bet this will stretch to Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and Madison. In that respect, perhaps it is fitting that the majority has chosen a NASA bill to advance their cynical agenda and pave the way for alien voting. This is one giant leap backwards for American election integrity. And if the majority actually thinks this bill is the solution to what's ailing America, Houston, we have a problem.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the author of the For the People Act, Mr. Sarbanes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, out in the country, the voice of the people is diminished by voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, and election subversion. Here in Washington, the voice of the people is diminished by big money, the insiders, the lobbyists, who use their influence to block progress on so many of the things that Americans care about. But we can do something about this. The Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act will ensure free and fair access to the ballot box with expanded registration opportunities and the broad availability of early voting and vote by mail, something that voters of both political parties took advantage of in the last election. It will ban partisan gerrymandering so that congressional districts are drawn fairly and with respect for the people. It will prevent the arbitrary removal of local election officials from their positions, and it will protect election officials from harassment and intimidation. It will pull dark money out of the shadows in order to combat the corrupting influence on our democracy, and it will make meaningful investments in efforts led by the states to strengthen and fortify their electoral infrastructure. Too many Americans have become cynical about our politics, and they are angry. But there is hope in that anger because it means they still care. They still believe in American democracy. They cherish it. In November 2020, 150 million Americans overcame tremendous obstacles to get to the ballot box, to pull our democracy back from the brink. The question now is, will we do our part? As their elected representatives, will we show that our love for this great republic is equal to theirs? Will we exercise the right to vote that we have in this chamber in order to protect the right of every American to vote in their local library or their firehouse or senior center? The answer must be yes. And after we pass this bill in the House, we look to our Senate colleagues to do whatever they can to secure the passage in that chamber. The stakes are too high. Failure is not an option. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a report by Common Cause that's titled Maryland General Assembly Approves Gerrymandered Congressional Map.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'd now like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, my good friend, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 5746, which contains the text of H.R. 4, the so-called John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. With H.R. 4, Democrats are attempting to orchestrate yet another radical and unprecedented federal power grab over state-administered elections, this time under the guise of updating the Voting Rights Act. But the history here is so important. Upon its enactment in 1965, the VRA employed extraordinary measures to address pervasive state resistance to removing radically discriminatory barriers that did, at that time, prevent minorities from exercising their right to vote. But here's what's important. After exhaustive review in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court's Shelby County v. Holder decision recognized an obvious fact when examining the Voting Rights Act. Things have changed dramatically since 1965. Of course, that fact should be celebrated. The court reasoned that requiring states to pre-clear election law changes today based on conduct a half-century ago was an unconstitutional invasion of state sovereignty. Republicans are thrilled the VRA worked. The truth is that more Americans from minority communities are voting now than ever before, and overall voter registration remains sky high. In fact, voter registration disparities between minority and non-minority voters in states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana are below the national average, and get this, lower than Democrat-run states like California, New York, and Delaware. However, Democrats would have you think exactly the opposite. They want to bring preclearance back through H.R. 4 and have all the states seek approval from Merrick Garland's Justice Department before they can make any changes to their election laws or redistricting, regardless of whether that jurisdiction has a history of discrimination or not. Again, this is a blatant federal power grab. These bills are contrary to the founders' intent, the plain text of the Constitution, and if they're fully implemented, they'll further erode Americans' faith and our confidence in our government institutions. We remain hopeful the people of our country will see through this. We urge a no vote today. I yield back to my friend and thank you for the time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Ohio, the distinguished and unrelenting chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, Ms. Joyce Beatty.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Desperate attempts hijacking our voting rights. That is exactly what our Republican colleagues are doing. And why? Because when Democrats vote, Democrats win, and we provide for our children, our families, and our businesses. I stand here today in support of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act of 2022 because black people representing the Congressional Black Caucus have stood in line, have been attacked by dogs, have put their lives on the line, crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge for us to have the right to vote. America, watch what's happening today. Watch what our Republicans are trying to do. Take away your fundamental right to vote. Let us restore our democracy. Let's stand up for what 4 Republican presidents in the past did. They reauthorized the voting rights. They are scared and they are hijacking Americans' rights. And I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, you can tell it must be NFL playoffs because we got our Super Bowl champion from the Oakland Raiders, my good friend, Mr. Owens, who's going to get 2 minutes of our time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Late yesterday afternoon, my Republican colleagues and I learned that Democrats were dropping H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 into what was supposed to be a NASA bill. The American people joined me in wondering why Democrats must resort to procedural gimmicks to ram their so-called voting rights bill to the floor. The answer is simple. Democrats are out of touch with Americans who've repeatedly rejected the Biden administration's far-left agenda, including its latest attempt to destroy the power of the states to run their own elections. Unfortunately, we're hearing the same message today that we've heard over and over again from the Democrats, that minority Americans are not smart enough, not educated enough, and are incapable of following basic laws and rules to vote in federal elections. And I personally am offended by this narrative. Earlier this year, the Senate Democrats held a hearing titled Jim Crow 2021, the latest assault on the right to vote, where they compared the recent voting laws in Georgia to the Jim Crow laws in the days of segregation. As I stated in that hearing, I grew up in the Deep South during an era of actual Jim Crow laws that suppressed voting. What does actual voting suppression look like? It looks like poll tax, property tests, illiteracy tests, violence and intimidation at the polls. It looks like segregated schools I attended in Florida, or segregated drinking fountains and restrooms that my race was forced to use. One section of the Georgia law that brought so much outrage from the left simply requires everyone applying for an absentee ballot to include evidence of a government-issued ID on our application. I can assure you, my friends, minorities are capable of getting driver's license, passports, government checks, and any other number of acceptable IDs. Today's misnamed For the People's Act won't fool Americans who have not forgotten how far we've come since 1965 and who hold sacred their constitutional right to vote. I ask my colleagues to join me in rejecting this latest attempt to remove power from the people in the states that best represent them. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania who serves on the Committee on House Administration and the Committee on the Judiciary, Ms. Mary Gay Scanlon.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to help bring this bill to the floor and to push for its consideration in the Senate. Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, which I represent, is the birthplace of our democratic republic, but it's now ground zero in the battle for the soul of our nation. A decade ago, when the last redistricting occurred, the Pennsylvania legislature launched an attack on election rights, which has only escalated over the years. Voters have had to battle in court to get fair districts and to overturn discriminatory voter ID laws that threaten to disenfranchise more than 500,000 eligible Pennsylvania voters. In the last 2 years, we've seen these threats multiply as the former president and his far-right allies have tried over and over again to make it harder to vote and to throw out the legal votes of Pennsylvania eligible voters. This bill is not a takeover of state elections. It's a response to attempts by state legislatures like Pennsylvania's to make it harder for Americans to express their most essential freedom, voting, by exercising our duty under Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution to protect that right. I urge all of my colleagues, no matter what party, to support this legislation, and I yield
Gentlewoman's
back.
time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I don't trust my folks over here with time as much as I do my good friend Lloyd there. Can you give us a time check?
Gentleman from North Carolina has 18 minutes.
I'd like to now yield 2.5 minutes to the ranking member from the House Judiciary Committee, my good friend Mr. Jordan.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, the Democrats have objected to counting the presidential electors every single time this century a Republican's been elected president. They spent 4 years trying to overturn the 2016 election. Democrats spied on a presidential campaign. They did impeachment in secret based on a so-called whistleblower whose identity only Congressman Schiff got to know. This Congress, they have closed the Capitol, enacted proxy voting, kicked Republicans off committee, and for the first time in American history, denied Republicans seats on a select committee that was chosen by the minority leader. They're trying to make D.C. a state, end the Electoral College, end the filibuster, pack the court, destroy executive privilege, take federal control of elections, and are currently allowing in jurisdictions illegal immigrants to vote. And finally, the January 6th committee has altered evidence and lied to the American people about it. But somehow they tell us it's President Trump and Republicans who are undermining democracy? Give me a break. Undermining democracy because we actually think you should show a photo ID when you go to vote? In 1 year's time, while Democrats are doing all that, in 1 year's time, they've given us record crime, record inflation, record illegal immigration. And as bad as all that is, it's not the worst. The worst is how they've used the virus to attack our freedoms, how they've used the virus to attack our First Amendment rights. And here's the irony. They used the virus to attack our liberties, even though everything they have told us about the virus has been wrong. They told us it didn't come from a lab. They told us it wasn't gain-of-function research. They told us it was only 15 days to slow the spread. They told us masks work. They told us we have a federal plan. Joe Biden said that himself. They told us there would never be a vaccine mandate. They told us people who get vaccinated can't get the virus. The vaccinated can't transmit the virus. And they told us there was no such thing as natural immunity. Think about this. Think about this. At the same time, Democrats require you to put on a mask, show your papers, and an ID to get a Big Mac at McDonald's. They want to allow the federal government to stop states from requiring a photo ID to vote.
Expired.
This is ridiculous. Vote no on this legislation.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, my friend who serves on the Committee on the Judiciary, Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support for the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Our democracy is built on the sacred principle that every American has an equal and fair right to vote. But states like my home state of Texas are imposing laws that are already limiting that very sacred right. Between bills like SB 1 and extreme gerrymandering, the voices of many Texans are being diluted and silenced, especially Latinos. We cannot let this stand. It is our responsibility, our duty to protect voting rights for every American, no matter what zip code they live in or what language they speak. The Freedom to Vote Act will do just that for Latinos and for all Americans. By banning partisan gerrymandering, restoring the Voting Rights Act, and creating new protections for voters, we will ensure every American makes their voice heard. Mi voto, mi voz. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's
Speaker.
time has expired. Gentleman yields. The gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to my good friend, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my good friend, Mr. Davis of Illinois. Mr. Speaker, Democrats have a scheme to take over elections, and it has taken a very disturbing turn. This federal takeover of elections bill is masquerading as a non-controversial, what was a non-controversial, NASA bill. The Constitution, Mr. Speaker, is clear. State legislators alone determine the time, place, and manner of elections, period. Voter participation, Mr. Speaker, over the past 20 years has enormously increased. It's well over 70% at this point because states have implemented policies assuring easy access while maintaining voter integrity to the best of their ability. Nevertheless, Democrats want a federal takeover of all election. This plan legalizes ballot harvesting nationwide, bans voter ID laws. Does America hear that? Prohibits the ask for an ID to vote. Somehow that is in the interests of our election integrity. I don't think so. It allows non-citizens to vote, Mr. Speaker, and imposes new mandates on all precincts, regardless of their size or resources. Perhaps most egregiously, they want to provide millions in taxpayer funds for campaigns. Under this taxpayer scheme, the American taxpayer would give our Speaker of the House $22 million, $44 million, a whopping $44 million to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer for his campaign. Americans can't get COVID tests, hospitals are being overwhelmed, business can't find
Gentleman's
workers.
time has expired.
This is the focus, to blow up the Senate filibuster and seize control of all elections to secure future
Gentleman's
Democrat
time has
majorities.
expired.
Let's vote no.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, my friend, Don Byer.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in robust support of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. I believe this is the most important vote any of us will ever vote upon. This is the bill that saves our democracy. The most fundamental idea of our exceptional nation is that people have the right to choose their leaders. And we've made slow progress over the centuries. African Americans, Native Americans, women, 18-year-olds. This bill finally establishes the basic fundamental right, voting rights for all Americans. With this act, we stand against efforts to manipulate voting rules in favor of the few and take our essential democratic privilege away from all Americans. NASA has inspired humanity for centuries, and now a small NASA bill becomes the vehicle to save our democracy. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman reserves, rather. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend from the state of Florida, Mr. Donalds.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important as we have this debate, frankly, on a bill that was dropped last night with provisions that have gone through this chamber before, which frankly have gone nowhere in the Senate. It's important to understand, for the context of this discussion, that I actually represent a pre-clearance county. I've lived in one for 20 years. It's Collier County, Florida. You see, pre-clearance, Collier County was subject to pre-clearance in 1965 under the Voting Rights Act. But since I've lived there the last 20 years, there has been no evidence whatsoever that Collier County should even continue to be subject to pre-clearance. So much so that the Supreme Court agreed and actually decided that it was no longer needed to do pre-clearance in the United States because the evidence did not suggest it. But what this bill seeks to do is unleash pre-clearance across the entire United States with no evidence for it being needed, the evidence that did exist in 1965. I represent such a county today. And something tells me that in 1965, I wouldn't represent that county then at that time. I do today. The evidence is clear. There is no reason to unleash pre-clearance on the United States. No need at all. The other provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act still exist today and will continue to exist. But the pre-clearance provision is no longer needed. So what is this really about? This is really about making sure that politicians have direct control over how elections are going to be administered in the several states, which, by the way, is a violation of the United States Constitution. Voting laws are supposed to be enacted by state legislatures, not here in Congress. That is the way the Constitution is written. So I think this is a bad bill. We should not be doing this, let alone funding, doing public financing of federal elections. Why would we ever want to do anything like that? We have more than enough money in our elections. We seem to spend billions of dollars every cycle doing this stuff. We want more. We want to take it from the taxpayers.
Time has
It's
expired.
outrageous. Vote no on this measure.
Sir.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished Democratic whip, my friend, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I am old enough to have grown up and become cognizant of public affairs in the late 50s and early 60s. It's ironic that today I'm hearing the language of interposition of states' rights. There were a lot of states' rights in the 50s and the 40s and the 60s. And John Lewis would tell you those states' rights kept people from voting, from participating, from playing a role. Now we have legislation before us that will ensure, as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 assured, that people would not be shut out by states' rights, by people who wanted to keep certain other people from voting and participating in their state's elections, in their county's election, in their municipal election, in their city election. I've heard a lot about states' rights. I'm old enough to have heard about what states' rights meant. They meant don't butt in to assuring that every United States citizen, one nation, under God, indivisible, but we were divisible. And we were divisible by color and by other arbitrary and unjustified distinctions. So we are here today to say that is not America. That is not one nation, under God, indivisible. And so, yes, all the states will be covered because we want all states to comply. And they will not have a thing to worry about under this legislation if they have not had violations within a 20-year period. Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker, on Monday we will mark what would have been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 93rd birthday. When he was born in 1929, it had only been 9 years, just 9 years from the date of his birth, that women were given the opportunity to vote in America. How sad that it took us so long. When he was born in 1929, it had only been 9 years since the 19th Amendment had been passed. And it had only been 64 years since the amendments ending slavery and ostensibly sad that it took us so long. When he was born in 1929, it had only been 9 years since the 19th Amendment had been passed, and it had only been 64 years since the amendments ending slavery and ostensibly When he was born in 1929, it had only been 9 years, just 9 years from the date of his birth, that women were given the opportunity to vote in America. How sad that it took us so long. When he was born in 1929, it had only been 9 years since the 19th Amendment had been passed, and it had only been 64 years since the amendments ending slavery and ostensibly Before he was killed, at just 39 years of age, Dr. King led a movement to correct the injustices that had come about because for so long, many Americans had no recourse to participate in our democracy or pursue opportunities equally because their states felt they had the right to discriminate. That's what state rights were in my generation. And apparently, the concept still exists that is the right. The right to vote is the guarantee to all others. Dr. King, joined by other giants of the civil rights movement, including our dear friend and brother, my, GK and I were just saying how sad we are that John Lewis is not on this floor, who gave blood and almost his life, but lived his life to assure that every American had the right to vote and was facilitated in that right. Dr. King, joined by other giants of the civil rights movement, including our friend and brother, John Lewis, used the tools of nonviolent, peaceful protests and organizing to expose the hypocrisy of a system that called itself a democracy but did not allow all of its citizens to share in electing leaders. Each year, on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, Americans reflect on the lessons of his life and on the civil rights movement as though they formed a chapter in America's past. Would that they mirrored simply the past, Mr. Speaker. But if we look around us today, there can be no doubt that the fight for our democracy is very much a part of our present. Now, this is a radical bill that will allow a process in the United States Senate that's a failing practice. The majority will rule on debating this bill. The majority. Isn't that a radical proposal? That the majority of the Senate that is for this bill. When people get up and say, oh, this bill can't pass, the only reason it can't pass is because the minority will stop it. If they can. I hope they can. I hope they change their rules. I am an opponent of the filibuster. It is undemocratic. And as Hamilton said, it poisons democracy. The right to vote has not been so endangered since Dr. King walked among us. But there's a remedy. It's not perfect, but it will go a long way toward turning back the tide of voter suppression and protecting the fundamental right to vote. One nation, under God, indivisible. All of us could vote. The legislation incorporated into this bill represents the boldest and most consequential voting rights reforms in a generation. I was the sponsor of the Help America Vote Act. It was called then a very consequential bill. It was not nearly as consequential as this bill will be in empowering every person eligible to vote. And by the way, every citizen, from my perspective, to vote, so there's no mischaracterization of my view. I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Representative Sewell, Representative Sarbanes, Chairwoman Beatty, and the entire Congressional Black Caucus, and literally hundreds of members who through the years have fought to protect this sacred right. In addition to providing for automatic online and same-day voter registration, the Freedom to Vote Act will make Election Day a federal holiday, a holy day, if you will, in the pursuit of our secular commitment to democracy. It will guarantee at least 15 days of early voting. Isn't that terrible? Well, it must be terrible because many states throughout the country are cutting those days down. Why? I don't know. If you vote on Tuesday as opposed to Thursday, is there more fraud involved? I don't know. It will guarantee those days and 2 weekends while ending requirements for difficult to obtain photo ID. It doesn't eliminate ID. If states have ID, it does not eliminate that. Importantly, this legislation will restore voting rights to those who have paid their debts to society, and it will ensure that those who cast eligible ballots provisionally in the wrong precincts will still have their votes counted. As the sponsor of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, that provision was in the federal law. This bill would limit partisan gerrymandering and remove the corrosive influence of dark money. My mother used to tell me, consider the source. If the money is dark and you don't know who's paying the bill for the talk that's being given to you, you can't make that judgment. You can't determine who the source is. When it comes to defending the integrity of our elections and our democracy, this legislation is absolutely needed in America. Not only will it prohibit the removal of election officials without cause, which is happening, because a president calls up and says, can't you find some more votes? That was the asking of some elected official, Secretary of State of Georgia, to commit a crime. Talk about fraud in elections. Also critical, this legislation will shore up the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, created under the Help America Vote Act, an agency created by, I just said that. It will enable the EAC to provide state and local boards of election with grants to upgrade outdated voting equipment and protect against hackers and cyber threats. It wasn't till 2003 that the federal government paid part of the election costs incurred in electing federal officials. Also restoring the full force of the 65 Voting Rights Act, which was undermined by Shelby versus Holder. Applying it to every state, not discrimination. If you break the law in any state, if you preclude people from legitimately voting in any state, you're covered under this legislation. We don't pick out any actor. Every state is included. We apply it to every state, and updating it for the 21st century. The Freedom to Vote Act has the power to restore trust that our elections are fair and that every eligible voter will be able to participate. House Democrats have passed voting rights measures multiple times this Congress, sending both H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 to the Senate. The majority's for it, but the filibuster stops it. The minority controls the majority. Madison said that was not democracy. Now the Senate must act. I urge senators to come together on Monday and approve this historic voting rights legislation for our time. We have the opportunity. I share G.K. Butterfield's sadness that John Lewis is not on this floor to cast his vote. And very frankly, I would have yielded all the time I've taken to John Lewis to talk to us about how important this legislation is and how many people gave their lives and their blood and their time and their talent to accomplish an America where no person would be shut out of the ballot box. In future years, I hope Americans will be able to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day by reflecting not only how our country overcame Jim Crow in the 20th century, but how we prevented its return in 2022. I know we've heard, oh, this is not Jim Crow, this is that. No matter how subtle the discrimination may be, it is discrimination. Cast your vote for this bill today, ladies and gentlemen, so our citizens cast their votes without hindrance and share equally in the making of our laws and in the shaping of our future. Vote yes. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and in the lengthy oration of 1 minute from the majority leader, I agreed with one word, that this is a radical bill. And the majority leader's argument is a baby throwing the baby out with the bathwater argument. The states in this country remain a bulwark of democracy. The rhetoric from Democrats is that democracy itself won't survive without their elections bill. Well, nothing speaks of preserving our democracy like a late-night gut and replace in the Rules Committee. A bill about NASA gets 700-plus pages added and a floor vote within 18 hours. Nothing speaks of preserving our democracy like giving Washington control of voter ID laws. When 35 elected state legislatures have adopted them, 74% of the people favor them. People in my state voted to put it in our state constitution, and most believe elections should be made more secure. Nothing speaks more of preserving our democracy than shifting the power to set election law from 50 decentralized states where legislatures controlled by different parties have predominantly held and exercised that power for all 233 years of our experience under the Constitution, and centralizing that power in a single agency, the Department of Justice, at any time controlled by one party. Nothing speaks of preserving our democracy like abandoning historic parliamentary norms to accomplish this radical transformation with bare majorities in both houses of Congress without one vote from the minority party. Democrats may continue gerrymandering in Illinois and Maryland with abandon, but they assure you that if you just put all the control of elections into their hands in Washington, they will save democracy for you. It calls to mind the iconic Vietnam-era phrase, "We had to burn the village to save it." America, that's Democrats' message to you. They will burn your democracy to the ground in order to save it. And they can't let anything stop them from getting it done before they face your verdict this November. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask my friend from North Carolina to refer to the bill, the section that refers to voter ID. It simply says, this bill sets uniform national standards for states that choose to require identification to vote. At this time, Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House of Representatives, Ms. Pelosi of California.
The honorable gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership. Mr. Speaker, today our nation faces the most dangerous assault on the vote since Jim Crow. Last year alone, more than 440 draconian voter restrictions have been introduced across 49 states, with at least 19 states enacting 34 measures into law. This legislation seeks not only to suppress access to the ballot, but empower states to nullify election results entirely. That's what the legislation that I referenced across the country. This sinister campaign has particularly targeted communities of color. As the House Committee on House Administration proved in last summer's report, partisan forces are accelerating a sinister campaign to silence the voices of color in particular. There are just four things I want people to know about the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. 4 things to remember and 1 observation. The 4 reasons why every member should vote for this bill today. First, it ends shameful voter suppression and election subversion, which lets local officials simply choose winners and losers based on their own political interest. Nullification of elections. Vote no on that. Secondly, it ends partisan gerrymandering so that the redistricting process will meet the standards of the Constitution, of the Voting Rights Act, and keep communities of interest together, ending partisan gerrymandering. One, and stopping voter suppression and voter nullification, election nullification. Two, ending partisan gerrymandering. Third, it stops big, dark, special interest money, which is suffocating the airways with misrepresentations, which does also suppress the voices of the American people. Get rid of big, dark money. People can still give their big, dark, special interest, but they have to disclose it so that the public knows. And fourth, this legislation empowers the grassroots by rewarding their participation in our democracy, amplifying their voice, and yes, with the power of matching their small dollar contributions. Hear this. There are no taxpayer dollars involved in that, no matter what you might hear them misrepresent. No taxpayer dollars. So 4 things. End voter suppression and election nullification, end political gerrymandering, end big, dark, special interest money crushing the political system, and 4, reward the grassroots. That is in the Freedom to Vote Act. In the John Lewis Act, which is part of what we're voting on today, I just want to be clear. This Voting Rights Act has been strongly bipartisan. Indeed, Republican Presidents Nixon, Ford, Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and George W. Bush, who signed the most recent Voting Rights Act, which received like 390 votes in the House, unanimous in the Senate, signed by George W. Bush, bipartisan. And 4 times, the Congress has reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in a bipartisan way. This is the first time we have the assault that we have on that. I'm very, very proud of the House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, because we have twice passed the For the People Act, which is this Protect Our Vote Is, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Even before he passed and had this named in his honor, we passed it once. The House has made clear we stand with the people in the fight for voting rights. I do want to, again, in closing, commend you, Mr. Butterfield, for your leadership on all of this, going around the country. John Sarbanes, the author of our For the People Act. Terry Sewell, the author of the Voting Rights Act. Zoe Lofgren, the chair of the House Administration Committee. Mr. Nadler, the chair of the Judiciary Committee. And I also want to acknowledge the work of Jim McGovern, the chair of the Rules Committee, who has brought these bills to the floor time and time again. It is a day when Democrats will once again take a strong step to defend our democracy as we send the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act to the Senate for urgent consideration. Nothing less is at stake than our democracy. With that, I urge a strong bipartisan aye vote on this legislation and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in objection to 5746, which is the latest attempt by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to ignore the 10th Amendment and dump on the state legislatures of this nation, basically telling them you're incompetent, not to mention the clerks. Democrats first tried to barge through the front door of the election administration with H.R. 1. After that failed, they tried an overall on the backdoor functions, and this bill represents a full-blown takeover. The supposedly slimmed-down bill would still override state laws by creating a federal right to no-excuse mail-in voting and require states to accept late-arriving ballots as long as they have timely postmarks. It's kind of a joke. It would automatically give felons the right to vote. Great. It would also override state voter ID requirements. Listen, only a few months ago, Mr. Speaker, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle argued that voter ID laws suppress voter turnout, only to flip-flop once they saw that the public overwhelmingly supports proof of identity before casting a ballot, 80% in some states. I'm proud to have implemented strong voter ID laws during my time in the Wisconsin legislature. Unfortunately, leading up to the 2020 election, I saw these protections steamrolled under the guise of the pandemic. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. In 2013, a decision recognized that we are no longer living in the Jim Crow era. The original Voters' Rights Act worked, and extreme policies like preclearance are no longer required. Allegations that election integrity measures that have been adopted by states such as Texas and Georgia don't amount to anything close to Jim Crow era restrictions, and is a slap in the face to those who endured real discrimination. There is no voting rights crisis. This is not about ensuring access to the polls. This is about taking power from the state legislatures and concentrating in our electoral systems. And I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Democratic whip, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn, who has led the way in this House and in the South for generations. Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. I thank my friend, the gentleman from North Carolina, for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise to urge passage of this legislation carrying the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to the Senate for immediate consideration to safeguard our most fundamental constitutional right, the right to vote. We took an oath to protect this country from all threats of foreign and domestic. Today, we face a domestic threat from those seeking to gain and hold power by suppressing votes and nullifying election results. Congress must combat this threat by ensuring equal and unencumbered access to the ballot box and ensuring an accurate vote count. It is time to choose. Will we uphold our oath and protect this fragile democracy? Or will we subvert the Constitution and fetter the franchise? I want to remind the previous speaker that we did not have Jim Crow before there was Jim Crow. And we did not have Jim Crow, we had it until 1954. I used to teach this stuff called history, and I will say to my colleagues, anything that's happened before can happen again. It was the lack of the vote that had 95 years between George Washington Murray, who was the last African American to represent South Carolina here in this body, until I came along in 1992.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Why? Because the right to vote was taken away.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Results were nullified. We are not going back. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to reserve at this time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, a coveted member of the House Committee on Administration, my friend, Jamie Raskin.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Floor Leader. Our colleagues object to guaranteeing the people's right to vote through the vehicle of a NASA bill, of all things. You know, a quarter century ago, Republicans changed Texas state law to permit astronauts to vote absentee from space. They want to make it easier to vote from space, and they want to make it harder to vote on Earth. In the last election, tens of thousands of citizens in Texas waited in line for 6 hours to vote. An astronaut on the International Space Station could have orbited planet Earth 4 times in the 6 hours that Texas forced some of its citizens to wait in line to vote. Across the country, it's voter suppression, GOP gerrymandering of our districts, right-wing court packing and judicial activism to destroy the Voting Rights Act in cases like Shelby County versus Holder and Brnovich, and deployment of the filibuster to block voting rights legislation. The whole matrix of GOP democracy suppression today. It's time to protect the right to vote here on Earth. If it takes a Nassau bill to do it, then I invite my GOP colleagues to boldly go where none of them have ever gone before, to planet Earth on a mission to defend the voting rights of the people. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Although it seems like, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to go where no man's ever gone before, and that's to call Mr. Loudermilk from Georgia my good friend.
Gentleman's recognized.
He's recognized for 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I rise today, obviously, in strong opposition to this latest attempts by my colleagues on the other side to enact a federal takeover of elections and continue their tactics that they have used consistently in this Congress and the last Congress to hide the intent of what they're doing. Make no mistake, this legislation is an attempt to circumvent state legislatures' constitutional authority to set election laws. Laws like the one recently passed in Georgia that maximizes voter access and protects the integrity of every legal ballot. One-size-fits-all government has never worked in a diverse and free society like we have here in the United States of America. One-size-fits-all is synonymous with dictatorial regimes, socialist societies, and communist countries. Governments that keep control over the people by stripping the authority from the hands of local officials that were elected by the people to represent them. This is what this bill does. Let's be clear. The goal of strong central governments, strong federal governments, is to have a homogeneous society that is easily controlled. Easily controlled. Our society is diverse, diversity of thought, diversity of action, diversity of speech. But the actions of my colleagues on the other side is to have a homogeneous society to where right and wrong is no longer determined by personal conviction or faith, but what the federal government has determined is right and wrong. You don't have to look any further of how the right to determine your own health care has been stripped away by my colleagues on the other side, where people can no longer determine what they will and will not put into their body. The Constitution protects the ideas of individual liberty and federalism to where government is strongest at the local level. This bill disregards state voter IDs, and one thing I want to bring up is homogeneous when it comes to campaign elections. Can I get 30?
Gentleman, 15 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 15 seconds.
I appreciate the gentleman here. We live in an independent, diverse society where local governments are the greatest authority over the people. This is in a takeover by the federal government to create a homogeneous society where everyone acts, thinks, and works according to the federal government. Oppose this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, the distinguished Vice Chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and I might say a member of the Election Subcommittee, of which I have the honor to chair, Mr. Aguilar.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for yielding. I rise today in support of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, legislation that would protect the right to vote and strengthen our democracy. This week, we heard President Biden travel to the home of our late colleague, John Lewis, rally the nation around the need to protect and expand the right to vote. Today, we will pass this legislation in honor of John's name. But in order to honor our colleague, we must make good on our commitment. We must pass this legislation in both chambers without delay. We must also make clear, as President Biden did this week, that there is nothing more important, no rules or procedures, than the health of our democracy. There's far too much at stake to let tradition get in the way of real progress. I know from my work on the committee and the Select Committee investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol that the concerns about the future of the American system, of the consent of the governed, are well-founded. Mr. Speaker, every member of this body has a choice today, and the world will remember where we stood. I am proud to stand on the side of democracy, on the side of making it easier to vote, not more difficult, and on the side of the people. Because the American people are with us. This is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and pass this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Reserved.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time, it is my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Alabama, my dear friend and the sponsor of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, Ms. Terry Sewell of Selma, Alabama.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, voting rights is personal to me. It was in my hometown in 1965 on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, where John Lewis and the foot soldiers shed blood for the equal right of all Americans to vote. 56 years later, old battles have become new again as state legislatures erect direct barriers to the ballot box. 400 bills introduced, 34 passed in 19 states. Once again, our nation is at an inflection point. Today, the House of Representatives will once again send voting rights over to the Senate, and it must pass, Mr. Speaker. I implore our senators, do what is right. You have changed your rules 150 times, most recently to raise the debt ceiling. If you can protect the full faith and credit of the United States, surely you can protect the democracy. The time is now. What we need is courage. As we prepare to observe the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King, let us remember that justice delayed can be justice denied. Senators, we need your leadership. We need it now.
I'd remind everyone to direct your remarks to the chair. Gentleman reserved, gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I appreciate that reminder. I'd like to now yield 1 minute to my good friend from the state of Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Republicans are trying to protect everyone's right to vote and the integrity of the election. It boggles my mind that in some cities in the United States, non-citizens are allowed to vote. And here in Washington, D.C. and other cities, when we go to a restaurant, we need to show our passport, vaccination database passport, saying that we're fully vaccinated before we're allowed to enter. But yet, my Democrat colleagues don't seem to want voter ID. In the state of Arizona, we have a law in place that requires voter ID to vote. We also have a law in place that was held up by the courts that prohibits ballot harvesting. Yet it continues to boggle my mind that our Democrat colleagues want to undo what the states have done, undo state rights. I am opposed to this bill.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to remind my friend from Arizona who just spoke that this bill sets uniform national standards for states that choose to require identification to vote. The bill gives states the flexibility to choose whether to require voter IDs. It is not a mandatory voter ID law. At this time, Madam Speaker, it is my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a thoughtful leader on the Committee on Judiciary, Mr. Mondaire Jones.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, my colleagues across the aisle have asked why we're voting today to protect our democracy. The answer is as clear to me as it is unimaginable to them. For the people. This one's for the people who made today possible, for the young people who cast their first votes in 2020, and for the seniors who cast their first votes in 1966 after passage of the original Voting Rights Act, for the people who, like John Lewis, put their lives on the line on Bloody Sunday, and for the people who risked their lives to overcome racist voter suppression at the height of this pandemic. For people like my mentor and professor, the late Lonnie Guinier, mother of the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act. For the people who don't have a vote, but who do have a voice. Voting rights are preservative of all other rights, but time is running out. We can still have a democracy, Madam Speaker, but only if we pass this legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, at this time, I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, my friend, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, who stays in perpetual motion, Ms. Rosa DeLauro.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Ensuring all Americans can freely participate in the electoral process is a bedrock of our democratic society. Today, in this country, we are witnessing an attack on that sacred right to vote, restricting voting access. We must act to restore federal oversight. What we do will determine the course of our democracy for generations to come. Our late colleague John Lewis shed blood for the right of all Americans to vote. Let us honor the legacy of those who fought to protect voting rights and pass this critical legislation. President Biden made our choice today clear, and I quote, "Will we choose democracy over autocracy, light over shadows, justice over injustice?" And like the President, I know where I stand, and I urge my colleagues to join me in voting for the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Reserve, please.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, may we inquire about how much time each side has remaining?
The gentleman from North Carolina has 6.5 minutes. The gentleman from Illinois has 2.25 minutes. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for giving us the time check. At this time, it is my delight to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, my friend, and another member who stays in perpetual motion, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, a member of the Judiciary Committee, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
To the distinguished leader of this debate, Mr. Butterfield, for your service to this nation, I am grateful. This is a somber, sacred moment in our lives on this floor. I stand here in the name of the blood shed by those foot soldiers, Dr. Martin Luther King and John Robert Lewis, who shed his blood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. My friends who vote no today will disregard and ignore that bloodshed. I refuse to ignore the blood that was shed for the right to vote. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, this committee built over the course of 13 hearings in 2 Congresses, led by Jerry Nadler and Steve Cohen, the record for the John Robert Lewis bill. And for that, I am grateful, for I stand as a victim of the lack of preclearance. The bills that we have will eliminate a legislature, as Texas bill states, to overturn duly voters' choice. It will prevent the purging of voters, which happens all the time. It will protect you at the polls, and it will disallow people from interfering with your vote. It is now a sacred honor and charge. We must vote now in the name of Martin King and John Robert Lewis. We cannot do any less. The Senate must do its job. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd reserve, please.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this time I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, from Houston, Texas, Harris County, my friend, my classmate, Congressman Al Green, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker, and still I rise. Our country has a history of discriminating against people of color and women when it comes to the right to vote. But that all changed in 1965 when President Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Because you see, prior to his signing that act in 1965, there were 4 Asian members of Congress. In 2021, there were 21 members. There were 4 Latino members of Congress. In 2021, 54. There were 6 black members of Congress. In 2021, 60. And there were 18 women in Congress in 1965, and in 2021, there were 147. We must restore the Voting Rights Act and protect democracy. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to reserve, please.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. At this time, in the interest of time, I will yield 1/2 minute, that's 30 seconds, to the gentleman from Dallas, Texas, my friend, Congressman Colin Allred from the 32nd Congressional District.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, this should be a bipartisan vote. The right to vote has been reauthorized, and the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized overwhelmingly by bipartisan majorities in this House and unanimously in the Senate. My constituent, George W. Bush, signed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. But now it's time for us to not just restore the Voting Rights Act, but to make sure that we expand voting rights across the country, to give us a sword and a shield. The shield of the Voting Rights Act to protect the right to vote, to protect changes, and the sword of the Freedom to Vote Act, and the expansions that it will provide to vote by mail, voter registration, and allow every single American to make their voice heard in our elections. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
I'd like to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, again, how much time do we have remaining?
The gentleman has 4 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, I'm prepared to close.
Would the gentleman like to yield me a couple minutes, too?
I will yield time to you.
No,
All
I'm
right.
good. I'm good.
You are my friend, Mr. Davis, and I want the world to know that.
You are my friend. I appreciate it. I enjoy the debate, and I am prepared to close, if I may.
The gentleman is recognized.
It's friendships like this, Mr. Butterfield, that I look around this chamber, and I think we as America should be celebrating what America's doing right. Look at the diversity of who serves here in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was necessary to stop discrimination, and it's worked. But make no mistake, today's bill is not a voting rights bill. Today's bill, unfortunately, is a bill that leads to lining your own campaign coffers with public funds. Now, Speaker Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, was here on the floor today, and no matter how many times she says it, that there's no taxpayer funds, it doesn't make it true. Let me go through. What happens is the original H.R. 1, when proposed last Congress, did have taxpayer funding of political campaigns, our own campaigns, but now they take the first ever corporate money through corporate fines, they put it into the Department of Treasury's laundering machine, and it comes out as part of the Department of Treasury. That's not public funds. Does that mean when you send your check to pay your taxes and it goes to the Department of Treasury, that those aren't public funds? Every single person who votes yes for this bill that is not a voting rights bill is voting to line their own campaign pockets. That is not what the American people want. 94% of Americans say it's easy to vote. We have asked time and time again, give me one person to show up at a hearing that said that they wanted to vote in the last election and couldn't. Not one person has walked through that door. Not one person has showed up on a Zoom call. Not one person. Why in the world do we continue to try to gaslight the American people into thinking that this is about voting rights? This is not about voting rights. This is about lining your own campaign coffers. This is about breaking a tradition in the Senate. This is about taking over and winning elections for one side over the other.
Gentleman's time has expired.
No on this bill.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume in order to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, Madam Speaker, let me thank the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rodney Davis. When members of Congress say to each other, "You are my friend," I just want the world to know that we mean that sincerely. Mr. Davis and I are genuinely friends. I am the chairman of the subcommittee. He is the ranking member of our full committee, and we have a whole relationship. We respect each other. Thank you so much, Mr. Davis, and thank you to our chair of the full Committee on House Administration, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, who allowed me to manage the floor today, and I want to thank her for her leadership, not only on this committee, but also on the Committee on the Judiciary. Madam Speaker, this has been a healthy debate. This is the way Congress should work. This is a healthy debate, and I look forward to debate in the Senate. I hope it will start forthwith and conclude on Monday. I look forward to passage in the United States Senate. Madam Speaker, the choice before the House today is clear. We must protect our democracy. It is past time. It is past time for this Congress to act. Historically, Madam Speaker, the House is not in order.
House will be in order. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, it is past time for Congress to act. Historically, we have come together to protect the right to vote. From the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that I remember so well, its subsequent reauthorizations and various election administration bills, we have protected and expanded the right to vote. And Madam Speaker, we must do that again. The Voting Rights Act works. Along with Lonnie Guinier and Julius Chambers and Leslie Winter and Jack Greenberg of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I joined with them in the 1980s and successfully litigated Voting Rights Act cases in North Carolina. The Voting Rights Act works. Throughout my career, I have witnessed this body come together to ensure all Americans have a voice in this democracy. We must do that again now. One of our most sacred rights in this country is the right to vote. Indeed, as the Supreme Court observed in Westbury versus Sanders, other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. As a Congress, as a nation, we must not tolerate any voter suppression, any voter discrimination of any kind in any state in America. And so I respectfully urge all of my colleagues, Democrat and Republican, all 435 of us, I urge all of us to support this bill. Vote yes. And Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time for a vote.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 868, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion, the gentleman from Illinois.
I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of the House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Illinois. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representatives Presley and Grijalva, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Bass of California, Mr. Torres of New York, Ms. Wilson of Florida, and Ms. Pingree of Maine, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Speer, I inform the House that Representative Speer will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Mace of South Carolina from the House, that Ms. Mace will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Representatives Porter and McEachin, I inform the House that these members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As a member designated by Representative Ruiz, I inform the House that Representative Ruiz will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Blumenauer of Oregon, Mr. DeSanyi of California, Mr. Lowenthal of California, Ms. Barragan of California, Mr. Liu of California, Ms. Moore of Wisconsin, Mr. Cohen of Tennessee, and Mr. Moulton of Massachusetts, I inform the House that these 8 members will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Yes, ma'am. Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Nels of Texas, I inform the House that Mr. Nels will vote nay on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Delaware seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. DeGette of Colorado, I inform the House that Ms. DeGette will vote yes on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Speaker, as the member designated by Reps. Christ, Cardenas, Castor, and Lawson, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on the motion.
Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
The member designated by Chairwoman Zoe Lofgren, Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, and Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, I inform the House that these members will vote yea on the motion.
does the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts seek
Thank you.
recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Representative Welsh of Vermont, I inform the House that Representative Welsh will vote yes on the motion.
What purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Hagedorn from Minnesota, I inform the House that Mr. Hagedorn will be voting no on H.R. 5746. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by members Swazi, Pocan, Doggett, and Jayapal, I rise to inform the House that these members will vote aye on the motion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Louis Gohmert of the great state of Texas, I inform the House that Mr. Gohmert will vote no on H.R. 5746.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, as the member designated by Chairwoman Maxine Waters, I inform the House that Chairwoman Waters will vote yes on the motion.
Purpose does the gentlewoman
Schreier, I inform the House that
On this vote, the yeas are 220. The nays are 203. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The motion is passed. What purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, for what purpose, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I may hereafter be considered the first sponsor of H.R. 4394, a bill originally introduced by Representative Nunes, a previous member from the state of California, for the purposes of adding co-sponsors and requesting reprinting pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 12.
Without objection. Thank you.
A.m. for legislative business.
Rise and extend my remarks.
Order in the House. Members take their conversations off the House floor.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring to the Majority Leader the schedule for next week.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, also ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Appreciate that. With that, I now yield to my friend, the gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader for the House.
I thank Mr. Scalise for yielding. Madam Speaker, on Tuesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed, as usual, till 6:30 p.m. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour and 12 p.m. for legislative business. And again, as usual, on Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. The House, Madam Speaker, will consider Senate 2959, the Supplemental Impact Aid Flexibility Act, under suspension of the rules. This bill passed the Senate unanimously, is on suspension in the House. It's co-authored by Representative Joe Courtney of the House. This bipartisan legislation allows local educational agencies participating in the Impact Aid program to use the student count or federal property valuation data from their fiscal year 22 program applications for their fiscal year 2023 applications. This, Madam Speaker, will prevent schools from losing substantial funding upon which they rely to address COVID-19 learning loss by giving them more flexibility to use pre-pandemic data to calculate funding needs. The House may consider other bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business tomorrow. The House will also consider H.R. 4673, the eVest Act, sponsored by Chairman Mark Turcano of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the rule for which we adopted this week. This legislation would automatically enroll eligible veterans into the VA healthcare system so that no veterans are left behind when it comes to receiving quality, affordable health care. Lastly, Madam Speaker, the House stands ready to act on the Build Back Better Act, as well as the Freedom to Vote and John R. Lewis Act, should the Senate amend them and send them back to us. Additional legislative items, of course, are possible. And I yield to my friend from Louisiana.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. On the school bill, I know one of the big concerns many people have been raising is trying to get schools opened again. Last week it was reported that 5,200 different schools were closed last week. And I know this body has, this Congress has sent billions of dollars to school systems across the country. The intent was that that money be used to get schools opened, and yet there are some schools taking the money and staying closed, which goes against all the medical science out there. We know the damage that's doing to our young kids, but learning, depression, so many other challenges that it creates for them. Will there be any part of that legislation that helps require that in order to get money, schools have to be open? And I'll yield.
Because I don't have it in front of me and I haven't read it as carefully as perhaps I should have, but I don't know the specific answer to that question. What I do want to say, however, is that we need to have kids in school. Everybody says that the learning experience is substantially compromised by virtual learning. It's better than nothing, and it's been pursued very vigorously and with great positive effect. But having said that, we all think that young people ought to be back in schools. But I don't know whether this bill, which passed the Senate unanimously, deals with that particular aspect that the gentleman asked about. But let me say this, that I think every school system has adopted the premise that in school is better. Clearly, we have been assaulted by a virus whose transmissibility is substantially more than the previous virus, the Delta variant. The Omicron variant, as we know, one of the problems is it's easily caught, easily transmitted. The good news is if you've taken a vaccination and had a booster, your likelihood of you going to the hospital is much smaller. And if you go to the hospital, you're much less sick. But having said that, we continue to have a challenge to get this under control. And the administration properly so, and the overwhelming majority of the medical community properly so, and the overwhelming majority of scientists are recommending that we wear a mask, that we wear a KN95 or N95 mask, because they're much better than the surgical masks or the cloth masks, that we continue to wash our hands regularly, and then we continue to keep a distance. But the gentleman and I agree that we need to ensure that to the extent that it is possible, and that parents will send their children to school because of being dissuaded by the transmissibility of this disease, we need to have kids in school.
Well, the gentleman,
I'll yield back.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Maybe we can work on something that would ensure that as tax dollars are going to school systems, that it's going to keep the schools open, not to allow them to then shut down on the kids, because as we know, the science is very clear that kids are much better off in school, safer in school than not being in school, and then the learning experience dramatically less if they're not in school, as well as the mental conditions, the social development that's not occurring if they are not in the classroom. So we'll see. And I'll be happy to yield on that.
Because I think I think everybody's concerned about this. Certainly every parent in my district and your district is concerned about this, and anybody who's concerned about the welfare of our children is concerned about it. But I think it would be appropriate for me to say that the teachers of America, now my wife was a teacher, and I happen to believe that teachers are the most important people in any society because they educate the leadership and the citizens of tomorrow. But they have been put to an extraordinary challenge. And I have a granddaughter who has 4 children, so I have 4 great-grandchildren, 3 of whom are in school, and we're in school in 2020 and 2021. And Judy, my granddaughter, who's named after my wife, has told me on numerous occasions what extraordinary ends her children's teacher, there were 3 different teachers at different levels in the school system, the extraordinary efforts to which the teachers went to make sure that while they were home, while they were learning virtually, that they had a positive, productive experience. But all of them felt, I think, a lot easier to have kids in school if they can do so safely. But I think that bears saying, like medical personnel, they have been put to extraordinary stress, as have parents generally been put to stress. So I think the gentleman's concern is rightfully placed, and we need to do everything we can to make sure kids get back in school and have a learning experience like you and I had in the classroom. I yield back.
Thank you. And our teachers have been true heroes through this. Our hospital, our frontline hospital workers, people that work at grocery stores. We've seen so many people rising up to the challenge, and even where governments failed their ability to do their job. I know one challenge that hopefully we see resolved at the United States Supreme Court. It won't be today. We were expecting it maybe this week, but hopefully early next week we see the Supreme Court resolve these challenges where there were mandates on vaccines that required people to get fired from their job if they chose a healthcare decision on vaccinations. I've been vaccinated. I know a gentleman from Maryland has too, but for those who haven't, whether they're frontline hospital workers, teachers, people shouldn't be forced to lose their job based on that choice they make. But the Supreme Court will hopefully address that and resolve that next week. Something that's out of our hands now, but it is in the courts at the highest level. And I would yield to the gentleman on that.
Just because by my silence, I understand the gentleman's position, which is held by a number of people. My own view is that employers make a reasonable decision when they say to an employee, for the sake not only of the employee, but for everybody else in the workplace with whom they work, that is, you're required to be vaccinated because we believe that science and medical personnel tell us that is a much safer route. But I understand there's a difference on that. I personally, but even then, I know governors who have been against vaccines are not necessarily against the employer requiring that as an employee requirement as opposed to a governmental requirement.
And I would hope the government would drop that mandate, but if not, it's hopeful that the court would make it clear that the government doesn't have the authority to require that people get fired if they don't get vaccinated. Encourage people to follow the science. If they have questions or concerns, that's a conversation they should have with their doctor, not a government mandate. But as the gentleman knows, we may have disagreement on that, but fortunately for us, it will get resolved at the Supreme Court, hopefully early next week. I wanted to ask the gentleman, as well as we're looking at the schedule for next week, I didn't notice any of the bills that we've highlighted in the past that would address some of the many crises our country is facing, whether it's inflation, whether it's high gas prices, whether it's the border crisis, all that are running out of control, the empty shelves that we're seeing at so many stores. Will the gentleman commit to working with us to bring some of the bills to the floor to address the real crises that are hurting hardworking families, like the ones I just mentioned? And I would yield.
Well, the gentleman yield?
Yeah, not yield.
There's no doubt, first of all, let me say, inflation is a serious challenge confronting American families, particularly working families in this country. I live alone, and because it's just one person, I buy relatively small amounts of food at the grocery store. And I go to the grocery store nowadays, and whether it's the price of bacon, which is at $12 a pound for a good Hormel or another meat packing, it's high. And I think to myself how a family not doing as well as I'm doing and with kids to feed, how tough it is on them. So this inflation is very tough. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that's caused, obviously, by a pent-up demand, asking for a lot of goods and chasing a lot of goods. And elementary economics that any of us took in college know that there's a lot of resources chasing few resources, i.e. a lot of money chasing a short supply of goods, and that you have that demand that it drives prices up. This pandemic has had a global effect on supply chain. The supply chain has been substantially affected. This was not the fault of, frankly, either Biden or his predecessor in terms of what happened in the supply chain. In Singapore, they shut down companies, as you know, for months at a time. They just shut them down, which is one of the things that's led to this chip shortage, which has had ramifications. So I want to assure the gentleman that the administration, our side of the aisle, I know your side of the aisle, very concerned about the inflationary pressure that is putting such a stress on America's families. This pandemic has caused extraordinary, historic things to happen. That's the bad news. The good news is we've created more jobs in the last year and 2 months than were created. Of course, net, we lost jobs for the previous 4 years. Over 2 million jobs net lost. So the good news is that we have a number of economic statistics that are, in fact, positive. However, having said that, we do need to be very concerned about inflation. The administration's expressed their concern. We believe that the infrastructure bill will have a positive impact on inflation, assuming the Build Back Better Act passes, which I assume at some point it will. I think that's going to have a very positive effect on inflation because it will help the supply chain, it'll help the health of the people, employees, it'll make people more able to get out, child care, going to help people get back to work, which will have a positive impact on the supply chain and on the availability of goods and services. So I think we're moving in the right direction. Unemployment, as the gentleman knows, was down at 3.9%. So while inflation is up and unacceptably high, historically high over the last 40 years, we need to get it down. And we see this phenomena happening all over the world. This is not the fault of the president or the Congress. It's the fault of an extraordinary, invasive and widespread disease that has caused extraordinary disruptions within our society and economy. But we need to get a handle on it. We need to take action. So I'll talk to the gentleman about what issues he believes would be helpful in that regard.
And the gentleman yields back. Clearly, some of those bills that have been discussed and offered up in the past to address the inflationary problems, but also the policies of this administration that have caused that. And as we know from the energy crisis, it's not pandemic related that gas prices are so high. This president made a decision starting on day one of his administration to shut down American energy production, to shut down pipelines in America, greenlighting pipelines in other countries, begging foreign countries to make more oil, but shutting off and making it harder to make energy in America. Clearly, that self-imposed supply shortage has created higher prices that we would love to see addressed. We might disagree philosophically on how to get there, but I don't think there's much disagreement from people who spend over $100 filling their car up that it needs to change. But if you look at the workforce challenges, and every small business owner I talk to, I would imagine all of us could share similar stories. Our small business owners are telling us they can't find workers. You know, somebody might want to go to their favorite restaurant, but they're waiting an hour and a half and wondering why a third of the tables are empty because they can't get people to work. And so, as some might want to look at the unemployment number, clearly the number of people that are not even in the workforce that just stop working because they can get paid right now large amounts of money to stay at home is a challenge that we should confront here in this Congress to help encourage people to get back into the workforce, not to be paying people not to work. And the enhanced unemployment benefits were one part of that problem, but there are many other parts of that problem. But it's the idea that there are too many dollars, as the gentleman said. Chasing too few goods is the driver of inflation, but the biggest driver of that is all of the money that's been spent in Washington. And if you look at about $6 trillion that's been spent on various relief packages, some of it was targeted to COVID, which we all supported, very bipartisan. Some of it had nothing to do with COVID, which unfortunately has created higher inflation. There is talk right now that the administration, and I'm not sure if the Democrat leadership is having serious conversations on this, is looking at yet another bill, potentially over $1 trillion of additional spending. I would ask the gentleman, is that something being anticipated to be brought to the floor? I would urge, if that's being looked at, to not do it, because there's about $800 billion remaining from other relief packages that are unspent, and hopefully we stop the spending in Washington that's driving inflation and try to encourage the economy to get opened at a more rapid pace. And if people need additional help, to look to the money that's sitting there, the $800 billion that's unspent, rather than trillions more dollars that would be put into a marketplace that's already oversaturated with federal spending that's driving this inflation. And I would yield.
Thank you very much. Of course, as you know better than probably anybody, the Speaker appointed a task force to look exactly at that issue of the $800 billion and what has been done, what's been spent, to make sure that it's been properly spent, because you're the ranking member on the committee headed up by Jim Clyburn that is looking at those issues. I know you had a hearing this past week. Yes, we have a difference of opinion. The difference of opinion, you call it spending, I call it investment. We're investing in our children, we're investing in our families, we're investing in small businesses, we're investing in growth and opportunity. And we're investing in the ability of those folks that you talk about that are not in the workforce, the restaurant can't hire. Why can't they hire them? Because they're not paying sufficient amount to justify a mom getting child care, because child care is so expensive. So she's caught, or a single dad is caught in the catch-22 situation. If I go to work, I'll earn money, but I'll pay it all to child care. If I'm going to pay it all to child care, it's much better for me as a parent to be with my child. If the net result's going to be pretty much a wash. We're investing in that. We're investing in child care in the Build Back Better Act. We're investing in early childhood education, 3- and 4-year-olds. We believe that's investment, and it also is very important for that small business person, so that mom or dad who has that child who's then going to go and be in a preschool environment can have time to themselves so that they can, in fact, pursue employment without simply putting it from one pocket to another pocket, none of which is their pocket. So we believe the difference, I think, really is you look at it as spending, we look at it as investment. We think it will have a big, big return for our country. And that's what Build Back Better is about. And it's building back better. You say it was not related to the pandemic. It clearly was related to the pandemic. The pandemic hit us in the gut. It hit everybody throughout the world in the gut. We have recovered better than anybody else in the world. And that's because we invested, sometimes in a bipartisan way, and sometimes in a partisan way. But we invested in our people, in our children, our families, our businesses, and in our health generally of our country, and indeed trying to help other parts of the world as well, because this is a global pandemic that affects us all. But I think the real difference is we perceive this as an investment. We think it will help grow America. You know, I have as I'm sure you've heard me talk about from time to time, Make It in America agenda. Our investment in both the infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better will have a positive effect on making it in America. So we see it, Mr. Whip, as investment. We think it'll have a positive effect. We think it is having a positive effect. And as I say, unemployment's down below 4%, and jobs are up over 6 million over the last 11 months. So that's a good accomplishment. Is it enough? Do we still have people who aren't working for a varied number of reasons, and many of which are related to COVID-19? So we see it as an investment, and I'm hopeful the Build Back Better Act will pass, and I think that will have a positive effect, not only, as the President says, on the next 5 years, but on the next 5 generations. And so we're continuing to pursue that. But inflation, which is how we started this discussion, is a problem, and we need to deal with it. And I'd be glad to talk to the gentleman about what he thinks would be helpful to do that. And I know part of that is stop spending money. I think if we stop investing money, our country will not get to where it wants to be. And where it is now, with respect to the rest of the world, leading the rest of the world in terms of economic recovery from the pandemic. We're not there yet, but we're going to get there.
Thank the gentleman, and clearly we have a difference on what the effects of spending trillions of dollars would have, and Build Back Better, as the gentleman brought up, would be about $4.5 trillion of higher taxes, additional spending, things that by many accounts would increase inflation even higher. But we'll see where the Senate goes on that bill. I'm not sure if the gentleman's anticipating bringing other legislation, the bipartisan bills that we did to do things like create Operation Warp Speed, which was maybe one of the most successful things government did in reaction to a pandemic in the history of the world, to come up with not 1, not 2, but now 3 proven and effective vaccines in less than a year to a virus no one even knew about. Never happened in the history of the world, but something that we came together, Republicans and Democrats, with President Trump to achieve, a great achievement, something we would sure urge President Biden to build on, because President Biden did run with a promise that he would, quote, shut down the virus. Clearly, he has failed at that. We've asked through a number of different means to have hearings on some of the things we've heard concerns about, and I would start with testing. There was an article recently that the president was presented with a plan in October to come up with about 750 million tests that people could have for COVID at home that would be readily available by Christmas, where they in October anticipated a resurgence of COVID by December. It's been reported that the president rejected that plan. We've asked for a hearing into that. For whatever reason, the majority has not agreed to that. Here was a letter I had sent to Mr. Clyburn and Ms. Maloney through the Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus, as well as through the Oversight Committee. Myself and Ranking Member Comer asked to have a hearing into some of these things. The testing failures that were reported, if they're true, we ought to hear about them. If they're false, the administration ought to be pointing that out. They have not. which tells me they must be true, but then why in October would the president have rejected a testing plan that could have prevented us from getting to the place we're at right now with this resurgence? What about some of the national plans that the president said he had as a candidate that then he later told governors recently he doesn't have a national plan on COVID? The mixed messaging coming from the administration is causing tremendous confusion across America, and we've asked that we have hearings to clarify, give the administration a chance to state their plan or the lack thereof, state whether or not they rejected a massive testing plan for the nation in October that would have prevented what happened in December. The lack of desire by the administration to be transparent about any of this is creating tremendous confusion across the country. This Congress could address that by holding hearings to get the facts out. I know we're going to continue to press for those kinds of hearings. I would hope we have them, but so far we have not gotten any response to the affirmative on that. And I don't know if the gentleman has anything to add. Maybe the gentleman would agree that we would have these kind of hearings to get some of these facts out or get some of these issues addressed, and I would yield.
For yielding, and I would say at the outset, I believe the committee on which he serves with Mr. Clyburn is one of the committees, among many, who ought to be looking at those facts. But let me say this, because in stating the facts as you just did, the appearance is that substantial progress has not been made. I don't think that premise is correct. Let me read you some statistics. Last year, the first year the president came into office, and testing in America was a molecular and at-home test per day. Last year, beginning of last year, 1.7 million per day. Today, 11.7 million tests per day are being conducted. So to imply that somehow there hasn't been substantial progress, that is a tenfold increase in the testing available to Americans every day. When Biden took office, 0 at-home rapid tests were available to consumers, 0. Today, 300 million at-home rapid tests are on the market each month. Enough? No. Are more coming? Yes. Has the government used the Defense Production Act to accomplish greater production? They have. The administration started using, as I said, just the Defense Production Act. Biden administration is increasing places people can get free tests, for instance. You talk about a plan. When Biden took office, there were only 2,500 pharmacies offering free testing. Today, there are 20,000 sites, an 8-fold increase. The administration is purchasing 500 million at-home rapid tests to be distributed for free to Americans who want them, with initial deliveries starting this month. The administration is distributing up to 50 million free at-home self-tests to community health centers and rural health clinics. In addition, already covering PCR tests, the administration is requiring private insurance plans to cover at-home tests starting on January 15th, just a couple of days from today. So a lot is happening. Is enough happening? Enough's not happening until everybody has immediate availability. Immediate may overstate it, but easy access. The fact is that some people are having problems finding the at-home tests now, and we need to work on that. But those statistics show you that extraordinary increases have occurred under the Biden administration, and that is their plan to make sure that these tests are available, because we know that testing will make a difference. So that if you find out if you're sick, you do quarantine. But I suggest to the gentleman that the Biden administration has made an extraordinary difference. Is the situation not where we want it to be? Absolutely it's not. Do we have a new variant that apparently came out of South Africa, or at least was first identified in South Africa, that spiked up? I talked to Dr. Monahan yesterday. Apparently, just in recent days, we've had a fall off in disease recognized. I hope that's the case, and I hope it keeps going down because we are perhaps now using the KN95 or N95 mask and keeping our distance a little more conscientiously. Let's hope all of that works for the people, for the country, and for the globe. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The problem with President Biden's plan is that it's been reactionary, not visionary. When he was presented with a plan in October to make sure that every American that needed a test would have it in December, when they in October said there will probably be a real uptick in December, the president said no to that. So if today he says, let's go and order 500 million tests, that sounds fine and well, except that he said no to that in October when he could have staved off what we see, and that is hours-long lines of people to get tested. People shouldn't have to be waiting 5 hours in a line to get tested when the president in October was presented with a plan. And again, if he wasn't, as it's been reported, he should come out publicly and say that. The report's been out for weeks now, and he hasn't done that. We should be having hearings on this to find out what was the plan that was presented, who was involved, by the way, in rejecting that plan. Was the CDC involved? Was NIH involved? Was HHS involved in rejecting a forward-thinking plan in October that predicted what inevitably did happen this Christmas? Who was involved in the rejection of that plan, and why did they do it? Is it that the administration doesn't want accountability? I don't know, but we've asked those questions, and we've asked for a hearing on that, and we've been told it's not going to happen. I hope the gentleman would help push to get this to happen, to find this out, so that we don't play catch-up every time something happens, when there were people saying, hey, let's try to stop something before it becomes a problem. If there are people in the White House who said, no, we're not going to do it until it's a problem for families, those people ought to be removed from the White House. They shouldn't be involved in the decision-making chain because their decisions caused maybe more deaths, surely caused a dramatic increase in the ills that people are facing right now because it could have been staved off, and it wasn't. And we don't have that information from an administration who promised to be transparent. We did have a hearing a few days ago in the Select Subcommittee, and it was a private hearing. It wasn't open to the public. I didn't agree with that, but that was the decision made by the majority. We've got to start having transparency, as was promised to people. People deserve the transparency. They deserve to have these questions answered, and frankly, they deserve to have a more forward-thinking plan, not a reactionary plan when forward-thinking was presented and rejected. I would yield to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This has been a pretty calm discussion so far. But let me remind the gentleman that the previous president said in February or March of 2020, this is going to go away in about 30 days. Don't worry about it. It'll go away. And a lot of your members said, we don't need a mask. We don't need to keep distance. We don't need to wash our hands. It's just going to go away. It's here today and gone tomorrow. That was the previous administration's plan. Now, I agree with you. Both the science community, the private sector community, and the government on Warp Speed did a good job. Extraordinary work in the private sector. Extraordinary work around the world because of the computer age in which we live, able to share information instantaneously in real time and say this alternative doesn't work, which accelerated greatly the ability to get within a year an extraordinary accomplishment, largely from our scientific and medical community, but facilitated by Warp Speed. No doubt about that. Give credit where credit is due. But very frankly, the leader, unlike President Biden said, this is a problem, we have to be careful, we have to pursue it, we have to invest, said no problem. Now, the gentleman conveniently forgets that. He also ignores the statistics I just gave, where we've had a 10-fold, 8-fold increase in the availability of testing and pharmaceutical access for literally millions of people. I mean, this is per day we're talking about. 11.7 million people per day. You know, it doesn't take too long at that rate that the whole country, all 330 million people, in about a month and a few days, has been taken care of. So when you say that we have to make progress, we have made extraordinary progress. And our view is, and I know we differ on this, we have made investments both in the American Recovery Act to deal with the pandemic crisis, with the infrastructure bill to create jobs and additional manufacturing capacity and training and apprenticeships for our people, and in Build Back Better to make sure that our families can keep their head above water and can, in fact, have child care on which they can rely and they feel their children are safe so they can take a job and be productive citizens and add to the growth of our economy. So we believe we're doing that. Are we doing it perfectly? None of us do it perfectly. Perhaps do we need to do more, as the gentleman implies, and have hearings? The gentleman says he was in a hearing. Private or public, I presume the gentleman had an opportunity to ask questions of the witness. I don't know who the witnesses were, so I don't know what expertise they had. I can't believe if you request of Mr. Clyburn that you have relevant witnesses to come by and that you want to question about the progress that either has been made or you think ought to be made or further things that could be done. I can't believe that he wouldn't agree to do that. But in any event, great progress is being made. But the entire world, not the Biden world, not America, the entire world is confronting a crisis, and it's having a tough time getting a hold of it. We have done it better than anybody else in terms of growing our economy and keeping our people's head above water. That's to be applauded. Do we still have a challenge? We do. Are we still working out? We are. Do we need to continue? Yes. I yield.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. And under President Trump, when he created Operation Warp Speed, the one thing he did say is that we're going to move red tape so that we can focus the entire scientific community, both the federal agencies, but also the private sector, in working together in removing the red tape so that they can focus on getting a vaccine. He didn't say 3, but he said, let's at least get them the ability to go. All of these great companies, many of that are American companies, to go put their innovation to work and get bureaucracy and red tape out of the way, follow science, but expedite so that we can get there quicker when many scientists, including some who still testify at committees today, said it was going to take years to get a vaccine. In less than a year, we had 3. And President Biden inherited that when he walked in the door, when he took the oath of office. He had 3 proven vaccines. And I know the gentleman talks about statistics. When you look at COVID deaths, because during the campaign, President Biden not only said he would crush the virus, but he said anybody who presided over that many deaths, and that was months before the election, doesn't deserve to be president of the United States. I thought that was an inappropriate statement, but more people have died under President Biden's watch from COVID than under President Trump's. It was an unfair standard that President Biden put in place when he was at one of the debates. But if he's going to say things like, I'm going to crush the virus and I'm going to have a plan, and then he comes out and obviously didn't crush the virus and then tells governors that there is no federal plan, I do think that's a mixed message at the least, that a dereliction in his promise at the worst that ought to be confronted. What is the plan? If there's a plan. If there's not a plan, admit there's not a plan. But you campaigned saying there was going to be a plan, and clearly there's not one. But those are other facts that we can put on the table. But clearly when you look at how President Trump pushed the federal government to work and partner with the private sector to move red tape so we can expedite the research and the trials, more tests than were ever done maybe on any other attempt for a vaccine, and come up in less than a year with vaccines when many said it would take years. Clearly a remarkable achievement that we all worked on. President Trump led the effort. We funded it in a very bipartisan way, and it was very effective. Obviously, this is a challenge for every country, but there were other things said that ought to be put out there, and let's at least try to all be saying the same thing and focusing on the same thing. And when scientific experts say, this is what we anticipate happening, if you're going to reject that science, at least hold people accountable who were part of the discussions to reject that science, as I refer to the October rejection of a testing plan that would have been in effect for December that was rejected. And
look, for a long time, the President of the United States, the former President of the United States apparently changed his view now and criticized DeSantis for not pursuing mask wearing, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is, of course, the former president discouraged wearing masks early on. Discouraged it. Oh, no, they don't need to wear a mask. He had events that were spreader events, as we call it. But the gentleman heard me say, I think the president followed good advice and made a decision on warp speed that was helpful. Now, as the gentleman noticed, it was noted, it was the scientists at NIH and the scientists in the private sector and scientists throughout the world, but mainly our people, who did an extraordinary thing in an extraordinary short time frame. Never been done before to develop this kind of a vaccine. You talk about the 3 vaccines, the 3 manufacturers, never been done before. So it was a wonderful event. Unfortunately, too many people are advising, don't take the vaccine. You don't have to take the vaccine. Don't sweat it. Now, very frankly, government tells people they've got to vaccinate their children to send them to school. Why? So other children don't get sick. I told you I had those great-grandchildren who are in school, 3 of whom are in school. And you know, they have a child sits in front of them, a child sits to their right, a child sits to their left, and a child sits behind them. I want all of them well, because I don't want my grandchild, my great-grandchild, getting sick. Very frankly, I don't think there was a very successful effort either by the former president or by many on your side of the aisle to say, do what the scientists, you talk about science, do what the scientists tell you to do. Now, I notice most of your members are doing so now, but still some wear it as a badge of courage that they don't, and they raise money off it. I think that is harmful to our communities. And I think you sort of just set aside no plan. Well, no plan has resulted going from 1.7 million to 11.7 million tests per day. That's the plan. And we invested in March in the Recovery Act in making sure that health services could respond properly. A lot of money went into health, as you know, and testing in that rescue plan, the American Rescue Plan. So you keep saying there's no plan. We've adopted plans. We think they are positive plans. And we think, hopefully, that we're going to get better soon. But neither President Trump nor President Biden were responsible for this extraordinary virus. Our view is President Trump laid back for a long, long time before he really engaged heavily in this. And now he's changed his tune to a much more positive, listen to the scientists kind of attitude, which we welcome. But I disagree with the gentleman that there's not a plan. We adopted together in 2020 5 major pieces of legislation to address this challenge. And we have adopted in a partisan way, unfortunately, bills that continue to fight that fight, and I think is fighting it not as successfully because we have a new variant, much more transmissible, a different type. It is metastasized into a more communicable disease, and that's caused us a challenge. And we're addressing that, and we're accelerating the availability of resources to do so. I yield.
And thank the gentleman for yielding. And clearly, we have some disagreements, but
Right.
As we both have advocated for the vaccine, I do think one of the differences that we may have is that I strongly feel that it's a personal decision. It's a medical decision. And if government thinks that shaming people and threatening people and firing people is going to address that challenge, they've missed the mark. And I just wish they would instead move away from the shaming and the firing, and hopefully the the U.S. Supreme Court agrees with us and stops at least the firings of people by mandates from the government, and just encourage people to have that conversation with their doctor if they have hesitation, but ultimately it's a decision that each individual would have to make, and we will continue this conversation, I'm sure, and I would yield.
I just want to say, in terms of where we are today, the overwhelming percentage, I'm talking about 90%, of people who are getting really sick are people who are not vaccinated. and for the government to say, you need to be vaccinated. Because we don't want you coming to the office. We don't want you coming with other people who are being careful, who have been vaccinated, who have done the responsible thing, and getting them sick. Because what we've seen, unfortunately, even with vaccination, people who are vaccinated, of our own members on both sides of the aisle who have been vaccinated, have gotten, thankfully, mild cases of COVID. But you know, when we talk about the president wanting people to get vaccinated, and you indicate that you and I are both advocates of that, or requiring them to get vaccinated, the reason you require people to get vaccinated, the more people you have unvaccinated, the more hosts this virus has to metastasize, to grow into different type of virus that can attack in different ways. That's why you do that. That's why they talk 70%. Now, we just have about 70% in America now. Very frankly, if we had a higher percentage, we'd be better off. So let's hope that, that we can work together to make sure that we give encouragement to people to do what the scientists, you talk about, the reason we were so successful in that year under warp speed of getting those 3 vaccines is because the scientists knew what had to be done. And they found out, and they had quick discoveries and eliminated a lot of dead ends relatively quickly because of our computer capability and transformation of information around the world and dead ends. If we listen to them, we'd be better off. But there are an awful lot of people who are saying, don't listen to them, don't do it. And when the gentleman says for health reasons, there are hundreds, probably billions, I don't know what the billions are, people have been vaccinated with a minuscule, almost undetectable adverse reaction. So I don't know what the gentleman talks about for health reasons. I know Djokovic says he's doing it for health reasons. I don't know what those are. Maybe you do. I'm not an expert enough to know what that is. But all the doctors I talk to, and certainly our own doctor here, who we consult with on a regular basis, I know both of us have done that, say, get the vaccine. So I would hope that all of us would ask our constituents, get the vaccine. It is good for you. It saves your lives. It saves your families. It saves others. Get it. I yield back.
And thanks. And to be clear, I never said it was for health reasons. I said it was a health decision. So this is a medical decision that people are making. And again, in the past, we've seen this suggested by some in the medical community inaccurately that if you get vaccinated, you can't get the virus. A Supreme Court justice said, if you get vaccinated, you can't spread the virus. That turned out to be false. We know whether vaccinated or not, you can get the virus, you can receive the virus, you can give it to other people, you can die. We know in the hospitals, the higher propensity of people in the hospitals are unvaccinated. Those are the kind of things that we should be encouraging to get the facts out, and then encouraging people to go make their decision with their doctor if they have concerns and questions. And there's valid questions. There's people in the past who have raised religious exemptions to other vaccines, and by the way, given approval for those religious exemptions that today are not getting similar religious exemptions for this. And so let's just treat it equally, let's treat it fairly, let's just focus on the facts. This idea that if you mandate something and threaten somebody, it's going to change behavior, it's just not proving itself to be correct, and it's causing more division and forcing people into corners that they shouldn't be on. And so hopefully, again, we can continue this conversation and get back to a place where we're in agreement, which we have been on things like Operation Warp Speed. But with that, I would be
I yield back.
happy to yield back. Thank you to the Majority Leader. Madam Speaker, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. Okay, for what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to commemorate 109 years of sisterhood, scholarship, and service in Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Founders Day embodies the living legacy of our predecessors. And today, 6 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, Congresswoman Val Demings, Congresswoman Lucy McBath, Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, and I stand proudly in our founders' footsteps. Happy Founders Day to the Columbus Alumni Chapter, Delta Kappa Chapter, and to all my sisters in Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. And I yield back.
The chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, messages from the Senate.
Madam Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S-2201, an act to manage supply chain risk through counterintelligence training and for other purposes, in which concurrence of the House is requested.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to address President Biden's COVID crisis. Sadly, COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations in the United States have reached record highs in the past week. Many Americans are having trouble finding COVID at-home tests and difficulties in scheduling a time to be tested with their health care provider. What is President Biden's response? In a recent COVID Zoom meeting with the governors, President Biden said, quote, "There is no federal solution," end quotes. Now, this mishandling of the pandemic is disappointing. Operation Warp Speed, developed under the previous administration, provided significant vaccines in record time. This initiative also established a robust distribution plan, innovative treatments, medical equipment, and ever-growing testing capacity. Madam Speaker, in addition to this, our families are struggling to pay for everyday goods as inflation reaches a 40-year high. We are facing a self-inflicted economic crisis as this administration encourages our workforce to stay at home. Our students continue to face uncertainty in their learning with last-minute school closures despite schools receiving ample COVID relief funding. To distract from these failures, President Biden and congressional Democrats are trying to change the rules in the Senate to pass the socialist
The gentleman's
agenda.
time has expired.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, on January 6th, we witnessed a violent coup attempt in our capital fueled by the big lie. Our country continues to face a slow-moving coup in the form of voter suppression. I've seen firsthand in my home state of Arizona voter suppression laws targeting people of color and a state Senate that would rather waste taxpayer money on a sham audit instead of upholding our most sacred democratic right, the right to vote. The Freedom to Vote, John Lewis Voting Rights Act, is critical to protecting the vote in my state and states across the country where restrictive laws are being put into place to strip people of the right to vote. Arizona will stand strong together this weekend. Thousands will gather this Saturday in Phoenix for democracy and voting rights. Passing this bill today answers their call by guaranteeing access to democracy for every Arizonan. Today, the House showed where it stands. We won't shrink from protecting our democracy and the voting rights of all Americans. It's past time for the U.S. Senate and Senator Sinema to do the same. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Mississippi seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor the memory of the late Granville Crane, surviving crew member of the USS Indianapolis and recipient of the Congressional Gold Medal. Mr. Crane was born in 1925 and turned 95 years old this year. He joined the ship's crew at the age of 16, one of the youngest crew members to join at the height of World War II. In 1945, he participated in a top-secret trip to deliver parts for the first nuclear weapon ever used in combat and was aboard the same ship when it was torpedoed and sunk that year. Hundreds of men went down with their ship, and many more faced dehydration, shark attacks, and exposure before there was any hope of rescue. Of 1,195 men aboard, Mr. Crane was one of only 316 who survived. As Mr. Crane waited to be rescued, he clung to his faith. Mr. Crane will be remembered as a family man, a hero, a survivor, a patriot, and a great man of God. On behalf of the 4th District and our great nation, we are forever in your debt. My prayers are with Mr. Crane's family at this time, and may he rest in peace. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise or extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
20 states, including Louisiana, still have the same hourly floor as a federal minimum wage, $7.25. Louisiana also has the second highest poverty rate of any state. That's because the minimum wage is a poverty wage. A full-time salary is less than $16,000 a year. No one can survive, much less raise a family, on that wage. While the federal minimum wage has not increased since 2009, the cost of housing, medicine, food, childcare has all exponentially increased. We cannot simply subject millions of our constituents to endure the trials of poverty. It's not a mystery. We can, we must, we know how to help. It's time to finally increase the federal minimum wage and lower the costs with a better Build Back Better Act. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. I rise today to bring attention to the latest Consumer Price Index data released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics just yesterday. This new data shows a 7% annual increase in inflation, the largest 12-month increase since 1982. The last time inflation was this out of control, Michael Jackson had just released Thriller. So from moonwalking to now sleepwalking with President Biden, we've continuously seen negative real wages, meaning our pay is actually decreasing when you account for inflation. And the president's only idea is to print and spend more money. Gasoline up 50%, propane, kerosene, firewood up 34%, and beef, veal, and bacon up 18%. Higher inflation is eroding the true purchasing power for all American families, and these record-breaking CPI numbers underestimate the real cost of inflation. Americans need leadership that will prioritize getting our economy and our nation back on its pre-pandemic performance. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I seek permission to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. January 14th marks the first time in 6 months that families will not receive an expanded child tax credit payment, a program to support children and families that Congress passed last spring with the American Rescue Plan. For the last 6 months, working and low-income families have had the relief of knowing that every month they would receive $250 per child and $300 for kids under 6. These payments have been a lifeline for families, helping them put food on the table and provide for children as the pandemic rages. As a result, child poverty and hunger have been dropped in this country by almost half. More than 7,600 families 76,000 families in my district receive these monthly payments, and they're worried about what will happen now that the payments have ended. Just last weekend, 2 constituents, a dad and a grandmother, approached me to say how important the CTC program had been. We cannot go backwards. The Senate must move quickly to pass the Build Back Better Act and extend the child tax credit. America's children are counting on us. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I'm honored to recognize an outstanding constituent of Texas 6, Battalion Chief David Maker, who has dutifully served the people of Waxahachie for the past 26 years. David was named Battalion Chief in 2018, but was leading in and out of the fire station well before that. Throughout his career, he has set the tone for what it means to be a good leader. I'm incredibly proud to announce that Chief Maker was named Firefighter of the Year for Waxahachie in 2021, an outstanding honor for which he deserves to be recognized. David also helps his community. He's done so by starting a nonprofit called Compassion for the Fatherless, which works with an orphanage overseas in fulfilling the needs of children by providing them with a strong foundation to be successful in life. David, you truly lead by example. I and the citizens of Waxahachie thank you for your incredible service and leadership in our community and to those who need it most. Congratulations on the well-deserved honor. I yield back my time. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Georgia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to announce that it's finally infrastructure year.
The gentlewoman will suspend. For what purpose does the gentlewoman seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask for consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I rise to announce that it's finally infrastructure year for Georgia's 5th Congressional District. I've seen firsthand how the infrastructure bill will transform the entire 5th Congressional District in Georgia. To share just a few projects, we're going to repair crumbling bridges in the city of South Fulton, extend the Peachtree Creek Greenway in Brookhaven, make Forest Park a more pedestrian-friendly city, and maintain Hartsville-Jackson's title as the world's busiest airport. We are delivering for the people. I'm especially proud that the infrastructure bill includes the Reconnecting Neighborhoods program based on legislation that I wrote. This program will reconnect neighborhoods like the Sweet Auburn district that was intentionally divided by the construction of federal interstates. This is a matter of racial justice because for far too often it was Black neighborhoods that were divided. I've met with community leaders to hear what they need from the program, and I'll continue to be their voice in Washington as they build back better. And I almost forgot. While we're making these decades overdue investments in infrastructure, we're going to also create millions of good-paying union jobs. Democrats have delivered for the 5th District and our country, and we're not done yet.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Speak for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
It was a very disappointing recess. I knew at least 3 more people who passed away because of the COVID. For that reason, I was very disappointed in President Biden's comments earlier today on television, in that I think he could have brought up things that would have prevented some of these unnecessary deaths. First of all, President Trump's COVID was cured by monoclonal antibodies 16 months ago. Nevertheless, in my district, we have a shortage of monoclonal antibodies. I have doctors or clinics calling me wondering where they are. It's a good question. They were available for the President of the United States 16 months ago, but for some reason, President Biden and his team has shortages of monoclonal antibodies in my district that I'm convinced would have saved some of these lives. The next thing I'll point out is that my doctors tell me that people are better off if they're taking vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, quercetin. All these things would save people's lives if they were taking them up front before they got the virus. But again, President Biden gives a big speech, no comments on this.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise for 1 minute and I ask unanimous consent to speak to the House.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Sometimes it's extremely difficult, Madam Speaker, to really convey in this form both the pain and the emotion of one's journey in life. I worked for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the conference that Dr. Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy organized and gathered foot soldiers from around America. They were, in fact, the beloved community and included the likes of John Robert Lewis and many others that sit in this house today. I walked on plantations and tried to register sharecroppers. And so I come today to recount for us the words of Dr. King, "We shall overcome," because the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We need to enact democracy reform now more than ever, because state lawmakers introduced over 440 suppression bills in 49 states. We cannot allow the other body to stand on some sort of pro forma dignity that they cannot overturn the filibuster. When people died for the vote, we honor Dr. King on Monday. I want that vote to be
The gentlewoman's
his
time has
honor
expired.
that we have voting rights. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Unanimous consent, address House for a minute and rise to the remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, we have a lot of lofty goals in this country about green energy, renewable energy and such, but we're not providing the ways in order to get there. One of the important components is the mined products that we need to go into the various equipment and into vehicles, et cetera. You know, we're not able to mine the critical minerals, the rare earths in this country. For example, to get a permit to open a type of a mine or expand a mine, it could be 15, 16, 18 years in this country, while our neighbors just north of the border, 2-3-year process to secure the permits to mine products that are desperately needed in this country. If we're ever going to talk about meeting the goals you would have for renewable energy, electric cars, and all that, in order to lower the carbon footprint. So what is the hypocrisy here? In my home state of California, you can hardly get mining done. You can hardly even keep electricity flowing because of taking away power plants due to, and these are power plants that would be zero CO2. I don't understand the hypocrisy. So we have to get smart about this. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and advise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor the life of a champion for democracy, David Sassoli, President of the European Parliament, who passed away earlier this week. President Sassoli was a respected leader of conviction and principle, a distinguished Italian journalist turned public servant dedicated to his service to helping vulnerable women, homelessness, individuals, and the rights of refugees. Sassoli was a symbol of balance and generosity to Europe. His leadership and commitment to social justice will not be forgotten. He will be remembered as a stalwart defender of shared European and American values of human rights, rule of law, and equality. I send my deepest condolences, as I do know members of the House do, to the people of the European Union, and my thoughts and prayers are with his family and loved ones. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, our constituents sent us here to deliver for them, and the bipartisan infrastructure law is delivering for San Diego. Recently, the Department of Transportation announced that $24 million has been allocated to the San Diego International Airport, supporting tourism for our international city and helping our economy recover. But it's not just the airport. $4.8 billion in highway funding has been allocated to California already, the first of more than $29 billion in road and bridge funding coming to our state. Last week, I visited sites in my district in El Cerrito, Kensington, and Talmadge, where neighborhood roads were cracked, crumbling, and in need of repair. I've spoken with constituents, local officials, and small business owners in La Mesa and El Cajon about the importance of transit, walkability, and broadband. Because this may be the largest infrastructure bill since Eisenhower, but it's also one that's focused on the needs of the 21st century. Connecting people by roads, transit, and high-speed internet can help us cross divides and expand opportunity, and it makes our society fairer, more sustainable, and more equitable. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to join President Biden and my colleagues in Congress in calling for action, long overdue action, to protect the right to vote. President Biden delivered a powerful speech this week in Georgia, and I am hopeful that this stiffened the spines of some of those here in the Capitol. I know that I want to live in the America of John Lewis, not Bull Connor, and the America of Dr. King, not George Wallace. Today, I was proud to vote for the vital legislation to protect the essential right to vote. Now the Senate must act using all available means. The filibuster is not a law, and it is not in the Constitution. It is a tradition that has been misused throughout history to deny civil and voting rights, and it is being used again today. What is in the Constitution? The right to vote. Ahead of Dr. Martin Luther King Day, it is time to honor those who came before us to secure the America that we live in today. The eyes of history are upon us. We cannot let this moment pass us by. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Every American deserves the opportunities that a good-paying job makes possible. Working with the Biden-Harris administration, Democrats in Congress have expanded those opportunities. Thanks to investments like the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law, job creation is at record levels. The bipartisan infrastructure law will create millions more good-paying union jobs. Not only will it rebuild our roads and bridges, it invests in infrastructure that will spur economic development in our communities. Removing lead pipes and guaranteeing clean drinking water for 10 million more Americans will improve community health and help attract new companies that will bring jobs and investments. So will expanding reliable broadband and modernizing regional airports like the DeKalb-Taylor Municipal Airport in my district. Finally, expanding our electric vehicle charging network will give Americans more options when choosing a new car while accelerating climate action. I am so proud to work with the Biden-Harris administration to rebuild infrastructure for Illinois families, and we're just getting started.
Expired.
I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to honor the extraordinary life of Dr. Margaret Hill, who passed away peacefully last month at the age of 81. She was, for many who knew her, the heartbeat of San Bernardino. For 50 years, she devoted herself to ensuring all children have access to high-quality education. In 1971, she began as a high school teacher and would go on to serve as principal, assistant superintendent for San Bernardino County, an adjunct professor, and finally, the last decade, when I've known her more, as a school board member for San Bernardino City Unified. Through all her roles, Dr. Hill never wavered in her devotion to the children of our community. Her warmth, her wisdom, and her kind spirit will be missed, but her legacy lives on in the countless lives that she touched in the classroom and in the community. It was a privilege to know her, Madam Speaker. May she rest in peace. Yield back.
The chair lays before the House sundry communications.
The Honorable, the Speaker. Madam, on November 4th, 2021, the Committee on Ethics received notices of 2 fines imposed upon Representative Andrew Clyde by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. On November 8th, 2021, the committee received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Clyde by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. On November 9, 2021, the committee received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Clyde by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. On November 18, 2021, the committee received notice of 2 fines imposed upon Representative Clyde by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. On November 30, 2021, the committee received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Clyde by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. On November 30, 2021, the committee received an appeal from Representative Clyde of the above fines pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. The appeal was received after the committee adopted its written rules. A majority of the committee did not agree to the appeal. On December 3rd, 2021, the committee received notices of 3 fines imposed upon Representative Clyde by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. Representative Clyde did not appeal with the committee prior to the expiration of the time period specified in Clause 3G, 3B of House Rule 2. Signed, sincerely, Theodore E. Deutsch, Chairman, and Jackie Walorski, Ranking Member. The Honorable, the Speaker. Madam, on November 30th, 2021, the Committee on Ethics received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Marionette Miller Meeks by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Rule Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. Representative Miller Meeks did not file an appeal with the committee prior to the expiration of the time period specified in Clause 3G, 3B of House Rule 2. Signed, sincerely, Theodore E. Deutsch, Chairman, and Jackie Walorski, Ranking Member. The Honorable, the Speaker. Madam, on November 30th, 2021, the Committee on Ethics received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Lauren Boebert by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. Representative Boebert did not file an appeal with the committee prior to the expiration of the time period specified in Clause 3G, 3B of House Rule 2. Signed, sincerely, Theodore E. Deutsch, Chairman, and Jackie Walorski, Ranking Member. The Honorable, the Speaker. Madam, on November 30th, 2021, the Committee on Ethics received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. Representative Greene did not file an appeal with the committee prior to the expiration of the time period specified in Clause 3G, 3B of House Rule 2. On December 3rd, 2021, the committee received notice of a fine imposed upon Representative Greene by the Sergeant at Arms pursuant to House Resolution 38 and House Rule 2, Clause 3G. Representative Greene did not file an appeal with the committee prior to the expiration of the time period specified in Clause 3G, 3B of House Rule 2. Signed, sincerely, Theodore E. Deutsch, Chairman, and Jackie Walorski, Ranking Member.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I first got interested in and started studying history as an 8-year-old. I grew up in a parsonage where my brothers and I were required every morning before breakfast to recite a Bible verse. And every evening before retiring to bed, we had to share with our parents a current event. We didn't have television, and therefore, in order to carry out that rule, we had to read the newspapers. It was delivered to our home every afternoon. Today, those who are living down in my hometown of Sumter, you get the Sumter Daily Item in the morning. But back then, it was an afternoon paper. And it was when my interest in the presidential campaign of Harry Truman that attracted me to politics. Harry Truman ascended to the presidency from the vice presidency, and of course, no one gave him a chance to get elected on his own. He did not have, according to conventional wisdom, what it took. And he was going to be up against this scion, this big-time prosecutor from New York, Thomas Dewey. In fact, one Chicago newspaper was so assured of the outcome, they didn't bother to wait on the results to write the headlines for their newspapers the day after the election. And all of us remember that headline, Dewey wins. But when the votes were counted, all the votes counted, Truman had been elected president. That always intrigued me. This man with a limited educational background, a disability, without any of all the trappings of what would make one a big-time leader. And of course, when Truman left office, he was not very popular with a lot of people. In fact, his popularity was pretty low. But as we look back on history and people continue to write about history, they keep upgrading Truman. Most places I see now, he's in the top 10. In my opinion, he's in the top 5. I consider myself to this day a Truman Democrat. Now, after studying history, I went on to teach it. And I became a firm believer in George Santayana's admonition that those who cannot remember history, of course he said the past, are condemned to repeat it. And that's what brings me to this floor today. It's been a long, long time since I have stayed here on what we call Getaway Day to address this body doing what we call special orders. I listened intently today as we debated the legislation that was the vehicle by which we would send 2 pieces of legislation, the Freedom to Vote Act, an act that came into being a bill that was proposed by Senator Joe Manchin. And the second bill was the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, a bill that this body approved and sent over to the Senate as H.R. 4. And upon John Lewis's death, I came to this floor and asked and received unanimous consent to change the name of H.R. 4 to rename it in honor of John Lewis. And this body granted unanimous consent for that to happen. Now, John Lewis and I first met as 19-year-old college students. I was in Orangeburg. He was down in Orangeburg, South Carolina. He was down in Nashville, Tennessee. And we met on the campus of Morehouse College, where the vice president was on the day before yesterday, I think it was. It was also the weekend that I first met Martin Luther King Jr. Now, as is often the case, and we see quite a bit of it today, a disagreement cropped up between us so-called young Turks, those of us who were in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In fact, this was the second organizational meeting of SNCC. And SCLC, that was being run by Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy and others. And we asked Dr. King to come and meet with us so we could try to reconcile our differences. Dr. King came and agreed to a 1-hour meeting. That meeting convened at 10 p.m. in the evening. It was not over until 4 a.m. the next morning. I always refer to that evening and that meeting as my Saul to Paul transformation. I came out of that meeting a changed man. Well, I guess, boy. I have never been the same. I started reading everything I could about Dr. King. I went back to my campus. I got his book, his first book, Stride Toward Freedom. And, of course, all the way down through his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. I interacted with him several times over the years. And after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, one of Dr. King's first trips was to the little town of Kingstree, South Carolina, a rural town in Williamsburg County that is currently in my district. And when he came that day, he came to talk to us about all the marches we were having. I was living in Charleston at the time. My late wife and I got in our little Falcon and drove to Kingstree to be a part of that meeting. And Dr. King talked that day about marching. We had marched to integrate lunch counters. We had marched to get off the back of the bus. We had marched for a lot of social things. But he said to us on that day, it is time to march to the ballot boxes. March to the ballot boxes. He put a new definition on what marching was all about. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. In fact, not long ago, the local community decided to have a 50th anniversary celebration of that event and called me and asked would I attend. I told them I would be glad to attend. And of course, as I later got a phone call from a reporter who asked me what was I going to say at this 50th anniversary. And I told the reporter, I said, well, I think I'll reminisce a little bit about that day and the speech he gave. And he says, well, did you see it on television? How do you know about the speech? I said, I was there. The reporter didn't quite believe that I was there. And of course, he questioned me, wanting to know what I remembered most about that day. And I said to him, the thing I remember most about that day was that it was a very big storm. In fact, the storm was so bad until on our way there we had to stop and wait it out. And when I got there, I was sure that we were not going to have a celebration. But the sun came out. Dr. King came. But there was so much rain until that cow pasture, I told him, that we were in was not very conducive for the convention. The reporter was kind of quiet, hung up. A few days later, the reporter called me back. The reporter had gone to the Weather Bureau to check out my story about that day, and sheepishly reported to me that I've checked it out and your description of that day is pretty accurate. I said, well, I lived through it. The things you live through are the kind of things that you remember most, and you remember them best. I've lived through a lot growing up in South Carolina. I remember the conversations I had with my parents. My mother was a beautician. And as you can remember, imagine, a lot of conversations going in the beauty shop. So when my mother would sit down with me, we would often have discussions about information that flowed throughout the beauty shop. In fact, I wrote about one day coming home from school, one of the rules we had that we had to stop by the beauty shop to report in after school every day to make sure that things had gone okay. On this particular day when I went in to the beauty shop to make my report, there was a lady there that had grown up with my mother in the cotton field adjacent to the one that she grew up in over in Lee County, South Carolina. And when I walked in, I spoke. And this lady turned to me and says, my, how much you've grown since I last saw you. And my goodness, she said, your voice is beginning to change. And then she asked me a question. What it is that you want to be when you grow up? That question was asked of us very often back then. And I began to tell her how proud I was of that background that I had developed since 1948, studying Harry Truman, and how I had developed this interest in politics and government. And I told her I wanted to grow up and I wanted to be a member of the United States Congress. And that lady looked at me and very sternly said, son, don't you let anybody else hear you say that again. Now, that lady was not throwing cold water on my dreams. She just felt that a little black boy in Sumter, South Carolina should not have those kinds of dreams and aspirations. It was not safe for a little black boy to have those kinds of dreams. My mother never said anything that day. But that night when she closed the beauty shop, she came into the house and she called me to the kitchen table. And she sat me down and said, now, James, don't you let what that lady said to you today ruin your dreams. You stay in school. You study hard. You stay out of trouble. You can be able to live out your dreams and your aspirations. My mom did not live to see me get elected to Congress. She died in 1971. I didn't get here until 92. But I think about her almost every time I come into this chamber, how right she was. And so today, looking back on that history,